Somewhere in Mesopotamia, a scribe presses a reed into wet clay, recording a story about a man who built a boat to survive a flood sent to erase humanity. Thousands of miles away in ancient India, another storyteller describes a great fish warning a man named Manu that the waters are coming for everything. In Mesoamerica, in China, in the highlands of New Guinea, in the frozen sagas of Scandinavia, the same basic story keeps surfacing again and again. The world floods. Almost everyone dies. A handful of survivors start over. Here's what should stop you in your tracks. These cultures had no contact with each other. Separated by oceans, mountain ranges, thousands of years, entirely different languages and belief systems. And yet, somehow, they're all telling a version of the same terrifying story, a flood that ends one world and begins another. So what's actually going on here? Is this evidence of some shared ancestral memory, something so catastrophic it got burned into the collective consciousness of early humans before they even scattered across the globe? Or are we looking at something else entirely? Dozens of unrelated local disasters, real floods that devastated real communities, each one independently deciding to explain their tragedy the same way, because, well, water destroys and humans everywhere have always lived near it. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe floods are just the most natural fear for any society to imagine when picturing the end of everything. No civilization exists without water, and no civilization is safe from too much of it. That's the question we're going to sit with tonight. Not to answer it definitively, because honestly nobody can, but to explore it carefully. We're going to travel slowly through Mesopotamia and the Bible, through Greece and India, through China and Egypt, through the Norse world and the Americas, through the islands of the Pacific and the river valleys of Africa. We'll look at what archaeology actually tells us, what geologists have found buried in ancient seabeds and lake sediments, and where the science runs out and the mystery begins. Some of these flood stories might trace back to real events: rising seas after the last ice age, catastrophic outburst floods when ancient lakes broke their banks, tsunamis that swallowed entire coastlines in minutes. Others might be something more symbolic, stories about chaos and renewal, about humanity being given a second chance. We're not here to hand you a tidy conclusion wrapped in certainty. We're here to wander through the evidence together, calmly, patiently, the way good history should be told, especially at this hour, when your mind is starting to slow down and settle into stillness. Before we drift into ancient Sumer and the world's oldest flood account, I want to know something. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? I love reading these comments. Someone's in Lisbon at midnight. Someone's in Seoul just waking up. Someone's in Toronto trying to fall asleep after a long shift. It's strange and wonderful, all of us scattered across time zones, listening to the same ancient stories about floods that once scattered humanity across the very same earth. So go ahead, drop a comment. Tell me your city. Tell me your hour. It genuinely makes this feel less like a video and more like something we're doing together. And if these long, slow histories are becoming part of your nightly routine, the best way to support what we're doing here is simple. Follow the show on Spotify, listen there when you can, and if you're enjoying it, leave a 5-star review. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. The link is right there in the description. Now, let's go back. Back before writing, before cities, before anyone thought to carve a warning into stone. Let's go find out where these flood stories actually begin. Before we go wandering through Sumerian tablets and Sanskrit verses, we need to slow down for a moment and ask a question that sounds simple but really isn't. What actually counts as a flood story? Because if we're not careful here, we're going to make the same mistake a lot of popular history makes. We're going to lump together dozens of completely different kinds of stories, call them all the same thing, and convince ourselves we've found some grand unified mystery when really we've just been sloppy with our categories. So let's be precise. Let's sort these stories the way a careful researcher would, because the differences matter just as much as the similarities. First, there are creation waters. These aren't flood stories in the destructive sense at all. These are stories where the entire universe begins as water, formless, dark, endless ocean, and creation happens when land or gods or humans emerge out of that primordial sea. Ancient Egypt has this. So does early Mesopotamia. So does Genesis itself, actually, before Noah ever shows up. The waters in these stories aren't punishing anyone. They're just the raw material existence is built from. Comparing this to a story about a global deluge wiping out humanity is like comparing the ocean to a tsunami. Related, sure, but not the same event, not the same meaning. Then you've got seasonal inundation. This one's easy to overlook because it's not mythic in the dramatic sense at all. It's practical. The Nile floods every year. The Tigris and Euphrates flood every year. For the people living along these rivers, flooding wasn't the end of the world. It was the world working exactly as it should, depositing rich soil, making the harvest possible. These aren't stories about annihilation. If anything, they're stories about blessing, about rhythm, about a river doing what a river is supposed to do. Third, there are punishment narratives. Now we're getting into the territory most people think of when they hear flood myth. Gods, or a god, look down at humanity, see something they don't like, arrogance, noise, wickedness, and decide the whole mess needs to be wiped clean and started over. This is Noah's flood. This is Zeus deciding humanity in the Bronze Age had become too corrupt to continue. The flood here is a moral event. It's judgment dressed up as weather. And fourth, survivor narratives which often overlap with the punishment stories, but aren't always identical to them. These are the accounts that focus less on why the flood happened and more on how someone managed to live through it. The boat, the animals, the warning that arrives just in time. Manu and his fish. Utnapishtim and his ark. These stories are fundamentally about continuity, about the fact that even total destruction leaves a thread that survives to start weaving again. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting. Across all four of these categories, certain elements keep showing up again and again, almost like recurring characters in an ancient screenplay nobody remembers writing. A warning delivered before disaster strikes. Some kind of refuge, a boat, a mountain, a tower. Total or near total destruction of the world as it existed before. Animals playing a role, sometimes as saviours, sometimes as passengers, sometimes as the very messengers of warning. And finally, renewal. The world doesn't just end. It restarts, usually smaller, humbler, and supposedly wiser than before. That pattern is real. Nobody's imagining it. But here's the problem, and it's a problem we have to sit with honestly before we go any further. Similar elements don't automatically mean a shared origin. Human beings living near water have really only got a handful of ways to imagine total disaster. Rising water, falling rain, a boat, a mountain, some animals, some warning. There's only so much creative room when your entire civilization understands the world through rivers, rain, and coastlines. And there's another wrinkle here, maybe the most important one. Almost every flood story we know wasn't written down until centuries, sometimes millennia after it supposedly originated as oral tradition. Which means by the time a scribe finally carves it into clay or copies it onto papyrus, the story has already been reshaped by generations of retelling, by contact between cultures, by scribes with their own theological agendas. We're not hearing the original voice, we're hearing an echo of an echo. And we have to keep that firmly in mind as we start walking through these ancient waters one civilization at a time. So where do we begin looking for the earliest written version of this pattern? Not the earliest flood anyone ever told around a fire. That is lost to us. But the earliest version somebody pressed into wet clay, baked hard enough to outlast the city that made it. For that we go to Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. This was one of the first places on earth where people built cities at a truly enormous scale. Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, cities of mud brick rising from a flat alluvial plain, connected by canals, fields and river routes. It was fertile land, incredibly fertile, but it was also vulnerable in a way that would have been impossible to ignore. The Tigris and Euphrates did not behave like the Nile. Egypt's river flood came with a relatively dependable seasonal rhythm. Mesopotamian rivers were much less polite. Their waters could rise suddenly in spring, fed by rain and melting snow far away in the mountains of Anatolia and Iran. A river might overflow its banks, break through an irrigation canal, erase fields, collapse mud brick walls, and leave a city drowning in brown water and silence. For people living there, a flood was not an abstract image of destruction. It was a familiar danger, magnified in imagination until it became the destruction of everything. And from this landscape comes Ziusudra, one of the oldest named flood survivors we know. His story survives in fragments, which is fitting, really. A broken tablet from ancient Sumer, copied sometime in the early 2nd millennium BCE, preserving a much older tradition. Scholars usually call it the Eridu Genesis. The beginning is damaged. The middle is damaged. Entire lines are missing. Reading it feels a little like standing in a ruined city and trying to reconstruct the lives of people from a few walls and a handful of broken bowls. But enough remains to see the shape of the story. The gods have created humanity. Cities exist. Kings rule. And then, for reasons the surviving text does not fully explain, the great gods decide to send a flood. One god, Enki, who is associated with freshwater wisdom and clever solutions, does not entirely agree with this decision. He finds a way to warn Ziusudra, a righteous king and priest. Ziusudra is told to build a great boat. The details are not as complete as they are in later versions, but the basic pattern is already here. A divine warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel built before disaster. Then the storm comes. The text describes a terrifying flood that lasts for 7 days and 7 nights. Wind and water sweep across the land. The sun disappears. Humanity, or at least the world known to the storyteller, is overwhelmed. Then the waters begin to settle. Ziusudra opens the boat. He offers sacrifice to the gods, and in the surviving ending, he is granted a kind of immortality, sent to dwell in a distant, blessed land, not merely saved from death, but removed from ordinary human life altogether. Already thousands of years before the familiar biblical account was written in its final form, we have the bones of a story that will keep returning. Warning, boat, flood, survival, sacrifice, a human being preserved while the old world disappears beneath water. But Mesopotamia did not tell this story only once. It told it again and again, reshaping the reasons for the flood, the personality of the gods, and the meaning of survival. The next major version appears in the Atrahasis epic. Atrahasis means something like exceedingly wise, and this story gives us one of the strangest motives for a world-destroying flood in all ancient literature. Humanity is too noisy. That is the complaint. In the beginning, the lesser gods are exhausted from digging canals and doing the hard labour needed to maintain the world. So humans are created to take over the work. They farm, they build, they multiply, and eventually their noise becomes unbearable to Enlil, one of the highest gods associated with authority, storms, and the atmosphere. Imagine it. Humanity has become so numerous, so active, so endlessly loud, that a god cannot sleep. Enlil tries to reduce the population. First, he sends drought, then famine, then disease. Each time, the god Enki quietly helps humanity survive. But eventually Enlil decides on a final solution, a flood so vast that no one will escape. Again, Enki cannot openly defy the divine assembly. So he speaks to a wall, or perhaps to a reed hut, depending on how you translate the damaged lines. Behind that wall is Atrahasis. Enki tells him what is coming without technically telling him directly. It's the kind of divine loophole that ancient Mesopotamian stories seem to enjoy. Tear down your house. Build a boat, abandon possessions. Save life. Atrahasis obeys. He builds a huge sealed vessel, coats it with bitumen to keep out the water, and brings aboard family, animals, and whatever living things the story requires. Then the storm begins. And this is not a gentle rain. The gods themselves are frightened by what they have unleashed. The storm roars. Darkness covers the land. Even the divine beings retreat to the highest heaven, huddling together like dogs, according to one famous translation. The goddess Ishtar weeps over the destruction. She mourns the humans who have been wiped out, comparing them to fish filling the sea. Then comes one of the most haunting details in the whole epic. After the flood, the gods are hungry. Humans had been feeding them through offerings and sacrifices. Now humanity is gone. The flood has silenced the temples, extinguished the cooking fires, ended the rituals. When Atrahasis finally emerges and offers a sacrifice, the gods gather around the smell like flies. It is a deeply unromantic image. The gods are powerful, yes. They can destroy the world. But they are also impulsive, divided, dependent on the humans they punish. The flood was not necessarily moral justice in the later sense. It was a catastrophic decision, and afterward even the gods seem to realize they may have gone too far. Enlil is furious that anyone survived, but Enki argues that there were other ways to control humanity. He suggests limits: infant mortality, infertility, religious vows that prevent some people from having children. Harsh solutions certainly, but less final than drowning everyone. The flood ends not because humans become morally perfect. It ends because the gods decide total destruction is impractical. Then, centuries later, the same ancient current flows into one of the greatest works of Mesopotamian literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is not primarily a flood story. It is the story of a king who cannot accept death. After his friend Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh travels beyond the edges of the human world searching for Utnapishtim, a man who survived the flood and was granted eternal life. And when Gilgamesh finds him, Utnapishtim tells the old story again. The gods decide to destroy humanity. Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, warns Utnapishtim. Build a boat, make it immense, seal it against the water. Bring aboard the seed of all living things. Utnapishtim obeys, even as his neighbours wonder what exactly he is doing. Then the heavens break open for 6 days and 7 nights. The storm rages. The land is flattened. On the 7th day, the sea grows quiet. Utnapishtim looks out and sees only water. Humanity has become clay. Eventually his boat comes to rest on Mount Nimush, often identified with a mountain somewhere in the region of ancient Urartu. And then comes another set of details that will sound very familiar to later readers. Utnapishtim releases a dove. It finds nowhere to land and returns. He releases a swallow. It too returns. Finally, he releases a raven. The raven finds food or dry ground and does not come back. The waters are receding. Utnapishtim leaves the boat. He makes a sacrifice. The gods gather around its smell. Enlil arrives, angry once more that a human being has survived. But Ea rebukes him. Why punish everyone? Why not send a lion, a wolf, famine, disease? Why make the flood absolute? And then Utnapishtim and his wife are granted immortality. They are placed far away beyond the ordinary world, where Gilgamesh can visit them but never truly join them. That last detail matters. Gilgamesh comes looking for the secret of surviving death. But the flood survivor cannot give it to him. Utnapishtim's immortality is not a prize humanity can win. It is an exception, a strange gift from a disaster that cannot be repeated. So what are we supposed to do with these stories? Did they preserve the memory of one giant historical flood that destroyed all of Mesopotamia? Probably not in any simple literal sense. The Tigris and Euphrates basin has experienced countless floods across thousands of years. Archaeologists have found flood deposits at several ancient Mesopotamian cities, layers of river-laid silt interrupting old settlement levels. But these layers do not all date to the same time, and they do not prove a single region-wide catastrophe. A flooded city is not necessarily a flooded world. But for a Sumerian farmer or an Akkadian scribe, their world may have been the plain around their city, the canal network, the fields, the temple, the horizon. If that disappeared underwater, the distinction between local disaster and universal destruction could become very thin indeed. And there is another possibility. The stories were shaped not by one event, but by generations of flood experience. A devastating inundation remembered in one city, a storm surge in another, a canal failure, a river changing course, memories accumulating, growing larger with every retelling, until the flood becomes not one disaster, but the disaster. The water that ended the age before this one, from Mesopotamia, these stories would travel. Through trade, conquest, migration, scribal schools, and the long conversations between neighbouring peoples. And nowhere would their echoes become more famous than in the flood story of Noah. The story of Noah appears in the book of Genesis, chapters 6 through 9. For millions of people, it is not simply ancient literature. It is sacred history, a story about judgment, mercy, obedience, and the promise that the world, however damaged, can begin again. But it is also a story written in an ancient Near Eastern world already full of flood traditions. The similarities with the Mesopotamian accounts are too striking to miss. A divine decision to send a flood, one man warned in advance. A great vessel built before the waters rise, family and animals preserved. The boat coming to rest on a mountain, birds sent out to test where the land has appeared. A sacrifice after survival. These are not minor details. They are the basic architecture of the story. And yet Genesis does something very different with them. In the Mesopotamian versions, the flood can feel almost arbitrary. Humanity is noisy. The gods are irritated. The divine assembly makes a terrible decision, and then some of the gods regret it. But in Genesis, the reason is moral. The earth was filled with violence. That is the central charge. Genesis says that human wickedness had become great, that every inclination of the human heart was bent toward evil. The language is broad and dark. It does not identify one city, one king, or one offence. The whole human order has become corrupted. Violence has filled the earth. And the earth itself is described as ruined or spoiled by what people have done. So the flood is framed not as divine annoyance, but as judgment. This does not make the story easy. A flood that destroys nearly all life is still one of the most troubling images in Scripture. Readers and theologians have wrestled with it for centuries. But the narrative insists that the catastrophe has a moral context. The violence of humanity has consequences. A world built on cruelty cannot simply continue forever as if nothing has happened. And in the middle of that ruined world stands Noah. Noah is introduced with a remarkable phrase: "He found favour in the eyes of the Lord." He is called righteous in his generation, a man who walks with God. Not necessarily perfect in every imaginable sense. Genesis is not interested in presenting him as a flawless superhero, but he is faithful in a society described as corrupt from top to bottom. Then comes the command: build an ark. The word ark is important. In Hebrew it is teva, a word used elsewhere in the Bible only for the little basket that carries the infant Moses on the Nile. In both cases, it is less a ship in the ordinary sense than a sealed container of life floating on deadly water. Noah's Ark is enormous by ancient standards. Genesis gives exact measurements: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. The precise modern size depends on which ancient cubit you use, but the point is clear. This is a massive wooden vessel, more like a floating refuge than a boat designed for graceful travel. It has rooms, it has a roof, it is coated inside and out with pitch, the same practical waterproofing material that Mesopotamian boat builders knew well. Noah is told to bring food. He brings his wife, his sons and their wives. And he brings animals. Here the story has a detail that many retellings blur together. In one passage, Noah is told to take 2 of every kind, male and female. In another, he is told to take 7 pairs of clean animals and birds, and 1 pair of animals considered unclean. Scholars often notice these differences because they may reflect more than one older literary tradition woven into the final form of Genesis. But whatever the exact number, the meaning is clear. The ark is not only a shelter for one family, it is a small floating world, a seed bank of living creatures, creation in miniature, sealed against chaos. Then the rain begins. Genesis describes water coming from above and below. The floodgates of the heavens are opened, while the fountains of the great deep burst forth. This is ancient cosmology, a picture of the world surrounded by dangerous waters. Above the sky was a great store of water. Beneath the land was another deep. During the flood, the boundaries that normally held chaos back are undone. The world returns briefly to something like the condition before creation. In the opening chapter of Genesis, God brings order out of watery disorder. He separates waters from waters. He makes dry land appear. In the flood story, that order is reversed. Dry land vanishes. The world is overwhelmed. It is not merely rain, it is decreation. For 40 days and 40 nights, rain falls. The waters rise for much longer. The ark lifts above the earth while everything outside it disappears beneath the flood. And then, after the destruction, comes one of the quietest lines in the entire story. God remembered Noah. In biblical language, remembering does not mean God had forgotten and then suddenly recalled. It means turning attention towards someone, acting on their behalf. God remembers Noah, the animals and all the living things in the ark. A wind passes over the earth. The waters begin to subside. Again there is a deep echo of creation. Wind, breath, spirit. The Hebrew word can carry more than one of those meanings. The world begins to emerge from water once more. The ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat, probably meaning the mountainous region of Urartu in eastern Anatolia, rather than necessarily one specific peak identified on a modern map. Noah waits. Then he opens a window and sends out a raven. The raven flies back and forth over the waters. After that, Noah sends a dove. It returns because it finds nowhere to rest. He waits 7 days and sends it again. This time it comes back carrying a fresh olive leaf. It is one of the most famous images in the Bible, a small bird, a green leaf, proof that somewhere beyond the endless water, life has returned. After another 7 days, Noah sends the dove out once more. It does not return. Land is ready. The resemblance to Utnapishtim, releasing birds in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is obvious. There, too, birds are sent to discover whether the flood has ended. But Genesis changes the sequence and the symbolism. The raven and dove are not just practical tests. The dove with the olive leaf becomes an image of peace, restoration, and the possibility of a world healed after judgment. When Noah finally leaves the ark, he builds an altar and offers sacrifice. This too has a Mesopotamian parallel. Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim all offer sacrifices after the flood. But once again, Genesis gives the shared ancient pattern a different meaning. In Atrahasis, the gods crowd around the offering because they are hungry. They need human sacrifices. In Genesis, God does not need food. The sacrifice marks a restored relationship, and God makes a promise. Never again, God says, will all living creatures be destroyed by a flood. The regular patterns of the world will continue: seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night. Then comes the covenant. A covenant is more than a vague promise. It is a binding relationship, an agreement with obligations and signs. In Genesis, this covenant is not made only with Noah. It is made with his descendants, with every living creature, with birds, animals, and the earth itself. That is an astonishingly wide promise. The entire living world is included. Its sign is the rainbow. The Hebrew word is keshet, which can also mean a bow, the weapon used in war. Some interpreters see a powerful image in that double meaning. The divine bow is placed in the clouds. The weapon of judgment is set aside. Whether or not that was the original meaning intended by every ancient listener, the image remains gentle and memorable. After the storm, a bow of colour appears where the sky meets the rain, a reminder that destruction is not the final word. Modern scholars continue to debate how the Noah story reached its present form. Many think Genesis preserves traditions shaped over centuries, perhaps including material from different priestly and non-priestly sources. The double details, the differing numbers of animals, and the changing flood chronology are often cited as clues. Others emphasize the final literary unity of the story, the way its parts now work together as a meditation on creation, violence, judgment, and renewal. There is also no serious need to assume that Genesis is simply a copied version of Gilgamesh or Atrahasis. The relationship is more complicated than that. Biblical writers lived in the same broad cultural world as Mesopotamian storytellers. Ideas travelled, stories were adapted, images crossed borders. But each tradition used the flood to ask its own questions. Mesopotamian stories ask why the gods would destroy humanity and whether divine power can be trusted. Genesis asks what human violence does to the world and whether mercy can survive judgment. And that difference would matter enormously because after Noah steps onto dry land, the story does not end with an immortal survivor sent to a distant paradise. It ends with a covenant made in the ordinary world. A world where people will plant fields, raise children, make mistakes, and sometimes become violent again. A world still fragile, still dangerous, still full of water. But a world promised another chance. Across the sea from the worlds of Noah, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim, the Greeks told their own story of a ruined human race and two people who lived long enough to begin again. Their survivors were Deucalion and Pyrrha. Deucalion was the son of Prometheus, the clever Titan who had stolen fire for humanity. Pyrrha was his wife, daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora. So even before the flood begins, this is a family deeply connected to the Greek story of human frailty, divine anger, and the dangerous gifts that had entered the world. The reason for the flood changes somewhat depending on which ancient source you read. Greek myth was never one fixed book with one official version. It was a vast collection of poems, local traditions, plays, hymns, and stories retold over centuries. But the broad pattern is clear. Zeus looked down at humanity and saw a world becoming morally unbearable. In one famous version preserved most fully by the Roman poet Ovid, Zeus is especially horrified by the crimes of King Lycaon. Lycaon tests the god by serving him a meal containing human flesh. It is an act of cruelty, sacrilege, and hostility toward the sacred duty of hospitality. Zeus responds by destroying Lycaon's house with thunderbolts and transforming the king into a wolf. But Lycaon is not presented as an isolated monster. He is evidence of a wider sickness. The human world has become violent, faithless, and cruel. Zeus decides that punishment must reach beyond one palace or one king. He will send a flood. That moral framing should sound familiar by now. Like the biblical account, the Greek story connects the destruction of humanity to human wrongdoing. The world is not drowned because people are merely inconvenient or noisy. It is drowned because the order between gods, guests, families, and communities has broken down. And yet the Greek story has its own strange and beautiful logic. Prometheus, who has always been sympathetic to humanity, learns what Zeus intends. He warns his son Deucalion. Deucalion builds a chest, sometimes translated as a small ark, though it is not described with the enormous detail of Noah's vessel. He and Pyrrha climb inside with provisions and wait. Then Zeus opens the sky. Rain falls without stopping. Rivers swell beyond their banks. The sea rises over the land. Mountains disappear. Cities vanish. Human beings are swept away in the water. In Ovid's telling, wolves swim among sheep. Seals move through drowned forests. Dolphins leap where treetops used to be. It is a world with its boundaries erased. Land becomes sea. Wild animals and domestic animals lose their familiar places. The ordinary map of life is washed clean. For 9 days and 9 nights, Deucalion and Pyrrha drift across the flood. Eventually their vessel comes to rest on Mount Parnassus, the sacred mountain in central Greece, associated with Apollo, the Muses, and prophecy. Other versions name other mountains because flood traditions often attach themselves to local landscapes. But Parnassus became the best-known resting place. When the waters finally begin to retreat, Deucalion and Pyrrha emerge into a silent world. Imagine the stillness of it. No villages, no fires from distant farms, no voices from roads or fields, just wet stone, empty slopes, and 2 survivors standing in the remains of everything they knew. Like Noah after leaving the ark, they first turn toward the divine. They offer worship and seek guidance. They go to the oracle of Themis, an ancient goddess of justice, order, and prophecy. Their question is simple: how can humanity exist again? The oracle gives them an answer that sounds almost cruel in its mystery. They must leave the temple with veiled heads, loosen their clothing, and throw the bones of their mother behind them. At first, Pyrrha is horrified. How could they dishonour their mother's remains? But Deucalion thinks carefully. Their mother, he decides, must be the earth herself, and the bones of the earth are stones, so they pick up stones from the ground and cast them over their shoulders. The stones thrown by Deucalion become men. The stones thrown by Pyrrha become women. It is one of the oddest rebirth scenes in all mythology. Humanity does not emerge from an ark full of families. It does not descend from one protected household. It rises from the ground itself, hard, heavy, silent, and enduring. The ancient Greeks sometimes connected this story to a wordplay between Lars, stone, and Laos, people. Whether that wordplay preserves a very old feature of the myth or reflects later storytelling, the image is clear enough. The new people are stone-born. They are tough because they have come from rock. They are made for a world that has already proven dangerous. And Deucalion and Pyrrha do not merely repopulate the earth through stones. In later genealogies, they also become ancestors of Greek peoples. Their son Hellen is traditionally the ancestor of the Hellenes, the Greeks themselves. Other children become forebears of tribes and regions. The flood, then, is not only a story about the end of humanity, it is a story about Greek beginnings. But Deucalion's was not the only flood the Greeks remembered. There was also the flood of Ogyges, or Ogygus, an ancient king associated especially with Boeotia and Thebes. Some writers placed this flood before Deucalion's, sometimes vastly earlier. Others treated it as a regional catastrophe, devastating one part of Greece rather than the whole world. That distinction matters. Ancient people did not always imagine one single flood covering every mountain and every shore. They also remembered local disasters, rivers breaking through settlements, lakes overflowing, coastlines battered by storms, cities abandoned after water and mud made them unlivable. Over time, a terrible regional event could become attached to a legendary king, then pushed backward into the deep past, until it became a flood before history. Greek geography made these memories easy to understand. Greece is a land of steep mountains, narrow valleys, sudden streams, and deeply indented coastlines. Rain can arrive violently. Winter storms can tear across the Mediterranean. An earthquake beneath the sea can send destructive waves towards shore with very little warning. The Mediterranean is not an ocean of endless open water. It is a crowded world of islands, bays, cliffs, ports, and low coastal plains. A storm surge in the wrong place, a tsunami after an offshore earthquake, or days of relentless rain in a mountain watershed could transform familiar land into a disaster zone. The ancient eruption of Pyrrha on the island now called Santorini is often brought into these discussions. The eruption occurred in the 2nd millennium BCE and generated major disturbances across the Aegean. Exactly how destructive its tsunami was in particular places remains debated. It should not be casually identified as the origin of Deucalion's flood. The stories and the event do not line up neatly enough for that. But it reminds us that Greek storytellers lived in a region where sea, fire, and shaking earth could arrive together. The parallels with Near Eastern flood stories remain striking. A divine decision, a warning given to one righteous or favoured man, a vessel, a mountaintop, survival after universal-looking destruction, a new beginning. These similarities may reflect long-distance cultural contact, shared storytelling patterns, or simply the repeated human experience of water as the most overwhelming force in the landscape. Greece traded, fought, migrated, and exchanged ideas with the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East for centuries. Myths travelled along with metals, pottery, sailors, and merchants. But the Greek flood remains distinct. No covenant appears in the sky. No rainbow promises that the waters will never return. Instead, Deucalion and Pyrrha receive a riddle. They survive not only through obedience, but through interpretation. The new human race begins with an act of thought. They listen carefully. They understand a hidden meaning, and from the stones behind them people rise. Perhaps that is why the myth endured. After the waters take away the old world, the question is not simply who survives. It is whether the survivors can understand enough to build a better one. Farther east, in the ancient traditions of India, the survivor of the flood, is not warned by a god speaking from the sky. He is warned by a fish. His name is Manu, and in many Indian traditions, Manu is not just one fortunate man who escapes a disaster. He is a foundational ancestor, a lawgiver, the father of a renewed human world. The word Manava, meaning human being or descendant of Manu, carries an echo of that role. To tell the story of Manu is, in one sense, to tell the story of humanity beginning again. But like the Greek stories, and like the Mesopotamian and biblical accounts before them, the story does not exist in one single unchanging form. It developed over a very long time. Its earliest surviving version appears in a Vedic prose text called the Shatapatha Brahmana, probably composed in the first millennium BCE. Though it preserves traditions that may be older, later versions appear in the Mahabharata and in the Puranas, vast collections of Hindu religious narratives compiled and reshaped over centuries. The central pattern remains recognizable. A great flood is coming. One human being receives a warning. A boat preserves what must not be lost. And after the waters withdraw, life begins again. In the oldest version, Manu is performing his daily ritual washing when a tiny fish comes into his hands. The fish speaks. It asks Manu for protection. "Rear me," it says, in effect, "and I will save you." Manu does not know what this small creature means, but he agrees. He places the fish in a jar of water and cares for it. Then something remarkable happens. The fish grows. Soon the jar is too small. Manu moves it to a larger vessel. But the fish keeps growing. He moves it again and again, from container to pond, from pond to river, and finally into the sea. At each stage, the fish becomes too vast for the place that once held it. It is a quiet but powerful image. The little creature that seemed helpless is not helpless at all. The person offering protection will soon need protection in return. And then the fish gives its warning: a flood will come and destroy all living things. Manu must build a boat. When the waters rise, he must enter it. The fish tells him to wait for its return. It will have a horn on its head, and Manu must tie the boat to that horn with a rope. The flood arrives. The waters rise over the earth, swallowing the familiar world. Manu boards his boat, and the great fish appears as promised. Manu fastens the rope to its horn. Then the fish pulls the vessel through the endless water. Eventually it brings Manu to a mountain in the north. In some versions that mountain is named as the Himalayas. In others it is simply the northern mountain, a high place rising above destruction. Manu ties the boat there and waits as the waters slowly retreat. It is hard not to hear echoes of Noah's Ark coming to rest in the mountains of Ararat, or Deucalion's chest reaching Parnassus. A vessel, a summit, one small pocket of life held above a drowned world. But Manu's story is not simply an Indian version of those other tales. Its deepest concerns are different. The early Vedic account does not focus first on preserving pairs of animals, as in Genesis, nor does it concentrate on an angry god punishing human wickedness, as in many Greek, biblical, and Mesopotamian versions. The flood is terrible, but its moral cause is not always the main point. Instead, the story turns toward ritual, creation, and the fragile process of bringing life back into existence. After the flood, Manu is alone. For a year he performs religious rites and offers a sacrifice using curds, milk, butter, and water. From these offerings comes a being named Ida, sometimes understood as a woman, sometimes as a personification of sacrificial nourishment and renewal. Through Manu and Ida, life begins again. This is a very different kind of rebirth from the Greek story, where stones become people. It is also different from Noah's family stepping out of the ark to repopulate the world. For Manu, renewal comes through right action, through care, through ritual knowledge, through maintaining the relationship between human beings, the natural world, and the sacred order that holds existence together. Later retellings expand the story. In the Mahabharata, Manu is often given seeds to preserve. Some versions include the 7 great sages, the rishis, who enter the boat with him. This means that what survives is not only biological life, it is knowledge. Seeds carry future food, forests, medicine, and agriculture. The sages carry memory, ritual, learning, and the wisdom needed to rebuild society. That is an important difference. In many flood stories, survival means saving bodies. In the Indian tradition, survival increasingly means saving the conditions of civilization itself. The future needs grain to plant, teachers to instruct, sacred words to remember, and laws to guide the people who come after. The boat is not merely a refuge, it is a library, a seed store, and a small floating beginning of the next age. By the time of the Puranas, the fish receives an even greater identity. It is Vishnu, more specifically, it is Matsya, the fish, one of Vishnu's famous avatars, or divine descents into the world. Vishnu, in Hindu tradition, is often understood as the preserver, the god who sustains cosmic order when it is threatened by chaos. That makes the fish's role clearer in later interpretation. It is not just an unusually wise animal, it is the divine preserver arriving in a form small enough to fit in Manu's hands. And that detail matters. Vishnu does not first appear as a blazing king, an enormous warrior, or a voice of thunder. He comes as something vulnerable, a tiny fish asking to be cared for. Only afterward does Manu discover the scale of what he has encountered. In some later Puranic accounts, Matsya also rescues the sacred Vedas, which have been stolen or lost amid the cosmic waters. Here again, preservation is the central theme. The flood threatens not only human life, but the knowledge that makes a meaningful world possible. And so the myth becomes larger than one storm, one boat, or one family. It becomes a story of cycles. In Hindu cosmology, worlds are not always imagined as moving in a single straight line from creation to final ending. Time can unfold in vast repeating ages, with creation, destruction, sleep and renewal occurring on scales almost too large to imagine. Manu survives one such overwhelming transition. He becomes the bridge between worlds. This is where comparisons with other flood accounts can be useful, as long as we do not force them too far. Like Utnapishtim, Noah, and Deucalion, Manu is warned before catastrophe. Like them, he survives in a vessel. Like them, he reaches high ground and enters a world emptied by water. These are real similarities. Trade routes, migrations, shared ancient storytelling patterns, and the simple universal terror of floodwater may all have helped similar ideas travel and take root in different places. But there is no need to assume that every version came from one original event, or one original tale. The details matter. Noah preserves animal life under a covenant with God. Deucalion and Pyrrha recreate humanity through a riddle and stones. Manu preserves seeds, sages, sacrifice, and the possibility of creation itself. The waters destroy the world, but the fish ensures that the next one will not begin empty. And now, farther east again, the flood story changes. In China, the most famous ancient flood is not mainly about a single family climbing into a boat and waiting for the world to dry. There is no Chinese Noah sealing himself inside an ark. There is no Manu being pulled toward a mountain by a giant fish. Instead, the central question is much more practical, and in its own way, much more political. What do you do when the water will not go away? How do you live when rivers break their banks year after year, turning fields into marshes, villages into islands, and travel into a nightmare of mud and current? The answer, in the great Chinese tradition, is not escape. It is control, or perhaps more carefully, it is learning how to guide a force that cannot truly be controlled. The story centres on a flood often called the Great Flood, a disaster said to have covered vast regions of the ancient Chinese world. It appears in texts compiled many centuries after the events they describe, including the Book of Documents, or Shujing, and the Records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian. These sources do not give us a simple eyewitness account. They blend memory, moral teaching, political tradition, and mythic history. The Great Flood is placed in the age before the first hereditary dynasty, during the reigns of legendary sage kings such as Yao and Shun. Whether there was one single flood behind the story is uncertain, but the landscape behind it is very real. Northern China was shaped by rivers capable of astonishing violence, especially the Yellow River, carrying enormous quantities of fine yellow silt from the Loess Plateau. The river could slowly raise its own bed above the surrounding plain. When its embankments failed, the water did not merely overflow. It could change course. It could spread across hundreds of miles of farmland. It could erase the ordinary boundaries between river, field, road, and home. For communities living beside such waters, flooding was not necessarily one sudden ending of the whole world. It could be a long emergency, a season becoming years, a river refusing to return to its channel. In the Chinese story, the first man asked to confront this disaster is named Gun. Gun is the father of Yu, the hero who will eventually succeed where he fails. According to some versions, Gun tries to stop the flood by building barriers. He piles up earth, raises embankments, and attempts to hold the water back. In later mythic accounts, he uses a magical self-expanding soil called zirang, sometimes said to have been taken without permission from the supreme god. The soil grows wherever it is placed. It sounds like exactly what a flood-stricken world needs. More earth, higher walls, stronger banks, but Gun's plan fails. The waters remain. In some versions they simply overwhelm his works. In others, Gun is punished for stealing the sacred soil. He is executed or dies in disgrace after years of unsuccessful labour. His story is severe, but its lesson is clear. You cannot solve every water problem by trying to wall water in. Sometimes the barrier only delays the pressure. Sometimes it makes the eventual break more destructive. Then comes Yu. Yu is not remembered as the man who survived the flood. He is remembered as the man who worked. For years, tradition says, Yu travelled across the flooded land, studying the terrain, measuring the flow of rivers, opening channels, clearing silt, cutting through hills, and directing water toward the sea. Where Gun had tried to block the waters, Yu gave them a path. This is the heart of the story. Yu does not defeat water in a battle. He understands that water moves downhill, seeks openings, follows gradients, and gathers wherever the land allows it. The answer is not to demand that it stop being water. The answer is to reshape the human relationship with the landscape. It is an ancient engineering lesson turned into legend, and the legend gives Yu almost superhuman patience. One famous story says that during 13 years of flood control work, Yu passed by his own home 3 times and did not enter. On the first occasion, he heard that his wife had given birth. On another, he heard his child calling for him. Still, he continued onward. The story is not asking us to judge whether this happened exactly as told. It is showing us the qualities expected from an ideal ruler: discipline, sacrifice, endurance, and a willingness to place the needs of the people above private comfort. Eventually, Yu succeeds. The waters are channeled. The land becomes habitable. Agriculture can resume. Communities can settle. The flooded realm becomes organized into the 9 provinces. each associated in later tradition with its own soils, products, roots, and obligations. And because Yu brings order to the waters, he receives political authority. He is said to have founded the Zhai dynasty, traditionally regarded as China's first dynasty. This is why the Great Flood story mattered so much in Chinese political thought. Flood control was never just a technical matter. It was evidence that a ruler possessed virtue, competence, and the favour of heaven. A king who could organise labour, maintain canals, repair dikes, distribute grain, and protect fields, was proving that he deserved to rule. A king who failed might be understood as having lost heaven's support. Later Chinese thinkers developed this idea into what became known as the mandate of heaven. Dynasties did not rule forever simply because they were powerful. Their right to rule depended on moral order and effective government. Floods, famines, rebellions, and other disasters could be read as warnings that the mandate was slipping away. That does not mean every flood caused a dynasty to fall, but it does show why rivers held such political weight. To govern China was, in part, to govern water, and this leaves us with the historical question. Could the story of Gun and Yu preserve memory of real prehistoric flooding along the Yellow River? Possibly. The Yellow River has produced some of the most destructive floods in human history. Even in well-documented periods with large states, extensive dikes, and millions of people available for repair work. In earlier societies, with fewer resources and less organised labour, a major river disaster could have been overwhelming. One widely discussed theory focuses on a huge flood that may have occurred around 1920 BCE near Jishi Gorge in the upper Yellow River region. Researchers have argued that a landslide dam may have blocked the river, then collapsed, releasing an enormous flood downstream. The date is interesting because it falls near traditional chronologies for the beginning of the Jia dynasty. It is a fascinating possibility, but it remains a possibility. Even if such a flood occurred exactly as proposed, it would not prove that Yu was a historical individual, that the Zixie began immediately afterward, or that one disaster created the entire tradition. Stories can gather together memories from many floods, many generations, and many regions, until one legendary crisis carries the weight of all of them. Still, there is something unusually grounded about this Chinese flood tradition. The world is not renewed because a handful of survivors float above destruction. It is renewed because people survey land, move earth, organize labour, and learn to live beside dangerous rivers. The flood does not end when the water goes down. It ends when human beings find a way to make a future on the land it leaves behind. But there was another ancient river civilization where water carried a very different meaning. In Egypt, the flood was not always the enemy. For thousands of years the Nile rose with remarkable regularity. Each summer rains far to the south, in the Ethiopian highlands and equatorial regions, sent water north through the long narrow valley of Egypt. By late summer the river spilled across its floodplain. Fields disappeared beneath brown water. Villages built on higher ground became islands above a temporary inland sea. Then slowly the water withdrew, and what it left behind was life. A dark layer of fertile silt settled across the fields, renewing soil that had been exhausted by farming. In a land where rain was scarce and the desert pressed close on both sides, this annual inundation made agriculture possible. Egyptians could plant wheat, barley, flax, vegetables and orchards in the damp, freshly enriched earth. The Nile did not merely support Egypt, it organized Egyptian time. The Egyptian year was traditionally divided into 3 seasons. Akhet was the inundation, when the waters rose. Peret was the season of emergence, when water retreated and crops began to grow. Then came Shemu, the harvest season, when the fields gave back what the river had made possible. This is a very different emotional world from Mesopotamia, where sudden floods could arrive as terrifying destruction, or from the biblical story, where water becomes a judgment that wipes out nearly all humanity. For the Egyptians, floodwater could still be dangerous. A flood that was too low meant poor harvests and hunger. A flood that was too high could damage homes, drown animals, and destroy irrigation works. The Nile was never harmless, but its normal rhythm was a blessing. The ideal flood was not a world-ending event. It was the world continuing. Egyptian officials carefully watched the rivers rise. Devices called nilometers, often stone staircases or marked shafts connected to the river, helped measure the water level. These measurements mattered because they offered a rough prediction of the coming harvest. They also helped administrators plan taxes, grain storage, and labour. A ruler who ensured that canals were cleared, dikes repaired, and grain distributed in lean years was doing more than managing agriculture. He was helping preserve cosmic order. The Egyptians called this order Mat. It meant balance, truth, justice, and the proper arrangement of the world. The king was expected to maintain it. The Nile rising at the right time, the sun returning each morning, crops growing from the dark earth, society remaining stable. These were all signs that the universe was functioning as it should. And the river itself could be honoured as a divine power. The inundation was associated with Hapi, often shown as a generous, rounded figure carrying offerings of plants and food. Hapi was not exactly the Nile as a whole. He was the abundance of the flood, the force that made the land fertile. Hymns to Hapi praise him as one who feeds Egypt, brings grain, fills storehouses and gives life to people and animals alike. Imagine what that meant. In many flood stories, water rises and human beings pray for survival. In Egypt, people watched the river rise and hoped it would rise enough. That single difference helps explain why ancient Egypt did not leave us a close equivalent of Noah's Ark, Utnapishtim's boat, or Manu's vessel tied to the horn of a fish. Egyptian religion certainly knew destruction. It knew fear of water. It knew that beneath the ordered world waited something ancient, immense, and unpredictable. Before creation, according to Egyptian cosmology, there was none. Nun was the limitless primeval water, dark and without boundaries. Not a river, not an ocean in the ordinary sense, but the watery chaos that existed before land, sky, sunlight, gods, animals, and human beings. From these waters, in one major tradition, the creator god Atum emerged on the first mound of dry land. The image may have been shaped by the Egyptian landscape itself. Each year, as flood waters withdrew, dark earth emerged again from water. The first hill of creation could feel strangely familiar, land appearing where there had been only flood. But Nun was not simply evil. It was the source from which creation began. It remained outside the ordered world, always present, always capable of swallowing boundaries if Martet failed. The cosmos was not imagined as permanently safe. It required maintenance. Daily rituals, royal authority, and divine action kept chaos from returning. That is the Egyptian version of a terrifying possibility. Not necessarily one giant historical flood that destroyed every city. Something deeper. The fear that the ordered world could dissolve back into the waters from which it came. Egyptian myths also contain stories of divine destruction, though they do not follow the familiar flood pattern. One of the most famous is the tale often called the Book of the Heavenly Cow. In this story, humanity rebels against the aging sun god Ra. Ra consults the other gods, and they decide that humans must be punished. He sends his powerful eye, often identified with the goddess Hathor in her violent form as Sekhmet. Sekhmet descends among humanity and begins slaughtering rebels. The destruction becomes so terrible that Ra regrets what he has unleashed. To stop her, he orders beer to be mixed with red pigment so that it resembles blood. The drink is spread across the land. Sekhmet sees it, drinks deeply, becomes intoxicated, and her rage fades. Humanity survives. It is not a flood story. No chosen family builds an ark. No animal pairs are gathered. No mountain becomes the refuge of the last living people. But it is a story about almost total destruction, divine anger, and the fragile continuation of human life. It also ends with a changed world. Ra withdraws from close contact with humanity, ascending into the sky on the back of the heavenly cow. The separation between gods and people becomes part of the new cosmic order. So Egypt had myths of chaos. It had myths of punishment. It had myths in which humanity comes dangerously close to being wiped out. What it did not develop, at least in surviving texts, was a central national memory of a single deluge that erased the world and required a boatload of survivors to begin again. And that absence matters. It reminds us that ancient people did not all look at water and see the same thing. They lived in different landscapes. They depended on different rivers. They experienced different patterns of disaster and renewal. For a farmer on the Nile floodplain, the retreating water did not reveal a ruined world. It revealed black soil. It revealed the beginning of planting season. And perhaps that is why Egyptian imagination placed the greatest danger not in the annual flood itself, but in the loss of balance. Too much water, too little water, rebellion, drought, darkness, and the ever-present possibility that ordered land might vanish back into the endless waters of none. Far to the north, among the Norse-speaking peoples of Scandinavia and Iceland, water appears in a stranger form, not as a river that brings harvest, not as rain sent to punish a wicked humanity, but as blood. In the Norse creation story before the familiar world of fields, forests, villages and longships, there was a vast emptiness called Ginnunga Gap. On one side lay Niflheim, a realm of cold mist and poisonous rivers. On the other lay Muspelheim, a realm of fire and heat. Between them was the gap, where frost and flame met, something living emerged. His name was Ymir. Ymir was the first giant, an enormous ancestral being, from whom the race of frost giants descended. He existed before the gods who would later shape the world. Alongside him appeared a miraculous cow named Audhumla, who nourished Ymir with her milk while she licked salty ice blocks, and uncovered another being, Buri, ancestor of the gods. Already this is not a human story. There are no farmers watching a river rise, no city being warned, no king failing in his duties. The figures in this myth are elemental: frost, fire, blood, ice, giants and gods. It is a story about how the basic materials of existence came into being. Eventually Buri's descendants, the gods Odin, Vili and Ve, turned against Ymir. They killed him, and when a being as vast as Ymir died, his blood did not merely spill across the ground. It became a flood. According to the Norse account preserved in the Prose Edda, so much blood poured from Ymir's body that it drowned nearly all the frost giants. The flood was not rainwater, seawater, or a river overflowing its banks. It was the blood of the first giant, released in such overwhelming quantity that an entire race was nearly swept away. Only one giant escaped. His name was Bergelmir. Bergelmir survived with his wife by climbing into something called a luther. The Old Norse word is difficult to translate with certainty. It may have meant a wooden container, chest, trough, or some kind of hollow vessel. Later retellings often make it sound like an ark, but the surviving wording is much more mysterious than a carefully described boat. Still, the pattern feels familiar, a devastating flood, a nearly destroyed world, a tiny remnant carried above the waters. And from those survivors life begins again. Bergelmir and his wife became the ancestors of the later frost giants. In a sense, they are the Norse equivalent of a surviving family after catastrophe. Not Noah and his household, because they are not human, and they do not carry animals in pairs. Not Manu, protected by a divine fish. Not Deucalion and Pyrrha, restoring humanity after Zeus's flood. But the shape of the story is there. Waters erase almost everyone. A vessel-like refuge preserves a few. The survivors become the beginning of a new population. This is exactly the kind of resemblance that makes flood traditions so fascinating. Across widely separated cultures, storytellers repeatedly imagine survival as something small and enclosed. A boat, a chest, a raft, a mountain refuge, a sealed space floating above destruction. Perhaps that image is simply intuitive. If water rises beyond every boundary, then survival means finding one thing that will stay afloat. But the Norse story takes the idea somewhere very different. Ymir's flood is not a judgment on evil behaviour. The frost giants are not drowned because they have become corrupt. Bergelmir is not saved because he is especially righteous. No divine command tells him to prepare. No covenant follows. No rainbow appears in the sky as a promise that such destruction will never happen again. Instead, the flood is part of creation itself. The gods kill Ymir, and then they use his body to make the world. His flesh becomes the earth, his blood becomes the sea and waters. His bones become mountains, his teeth and broken fragments become stones. His skull becomes the sky. Sparks from the fiery realm are set into the heavens as stars. It is a brutal image, but also a strangely ancient one. The world is not made from nothing. It is made from the remains of something older. Land rises from a dead giant's flesh. Oceans are his blood. The sky is the inside of his skull. The ordered world exists because a primordial being was broken apart, and the forces released by that breaking were almost too immense for any life to survive. In that sense, Bergelmir's escape happens at the boundary between two worlds. Before the flood, there is the age of Ymir, the first giant and the first living being. After the flood, there is a newly arranged cosmos, ruled by gods, inhabited by giants, and eventually home to humans. The flood does not end history. It begins the world as the Norse knew it. But there is one more complication. The Norse myths we possess were written down relatively late. Much of what we know comes from medieval Icelandic manuscripts, including the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century. By then, Iceland had been Christian for generations. That does not mean the myths were invented by Christian writers. Their language, poetic forms, and references clearly preserve older pagan traditions. The verse about Bergelmir's survival is generally understood to reflect material older than the manuscripts that contain it. But it does mean we should be careful. We are not hearing an untouched voice from the Viking Age. We are hearing old stories filtered through later poets, scribes, scholars, and a society that had already encountered biblical ideas of creation, catastrophe, and sacred history. So was Bergelmir's vessel shaped by contact with Noah's Ark. Possibly some details may have been influenced by later retelling. Or perhaps the resemblance is much older, a recurring human way of imagining survival against overwhelming water. The evidence cannot give us a final answer. What it can show is that Northern Europe remembered water not only as weather, sea travel, or dangerous storm. It remembered water as a force powerful enough to wash away an entire race of giants, and then from one uncertain floating refuge to let the world continue, across the Atlantic, and across landscapes so vast they contain deserts, rainforests, high mountains, prairie grasslands, Arctic coasts, and thousands of miles of shoreline, flood stories appear again. But this is where we need to slow down. There was never one single American mythology. The Americas were home to countless distinct nations, languages, and historical traditions. Maya cities in the forests of Mesoamerica were not culturally interchangeable with Quechua-speaking communities in the Andes. The stories of peoples around the Great Lakes were not simply versions of stories told in the Amazon. Similar themes can appear across distance, but similarity is not proof that everyone remembered one event or that one story travelled unchanged from a single source. Still, the waters are there. In Mesoamerica, creation was often imagined not as one beginning, but as a series of beginnings. Worlds could be made, fail, and be remade. Humanity itself might take several attempts. The best-known surviving account comes from the Popol Vuh, the sacred narrative of the Quiche Maya, written down in the colonial period from traditions that were older than the manuscript. In this story, the creators first make animals, but the animals cannot speak the names of their makers. Then they form humans from mud, but these beings dissolve and fall apart. Next come people made of wood. The wooden people can move and multiply, but they have a terrible flaw. They do not remember their creators. They have no reverence, no understanding, no gratitude for the world around them. And so destruction comes. A great flood is unleashed. Rain falls, waters rise, the very objects of the wooden people's daily lives turn against them. Their dogs attack them. Their cooking stones strike back. Their homes collapse. The story is vivid, almost dreamlike, filled with a sense that a world without proper relationship has become hostile to those living inside it. Not every detail needs to be read as a historical weather report. The Popol Vuh is doing something much larger. It is asking what makes humans truly human: speech, memory, gratitude, the ability to recognize obligations to other beings. After the destruction of the wooden people, the creators eventually make humanity from maize. That detail matters. The flood does not merely wipe out a population. It clears the way for a more complete kind of person, one capable of participating in the moral and ceremonial order of the world. Other Mesoamerican traditions also remembered creation as fragile. Among the Nahua peoples of central Mexico, later recorded accounts describe successive cosmic ages, often called suns. Each age ended in catastrophe. One was destroyed by jaguars, another by wind, another by fiery rain, and one by water. In some versions, only a pair of people survive the watery destruction, taking refuge in a hollowed tree or a vessel. Their survival can sound remarkably familiar to readers who know Noah, Deucalion, or Manu. But familiar does not mean identical. The details, meanings, and ritual settings are their own. And if you enjoy these strange connections, this is a good moment to mention that the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries is available on the website, with the link waiting in the description. Far south in the Andes, flood stories rise among mountains that make ordinary rivers look small. In colonial-era accounts of Inca tradition, the creator deity Viracocha makes an early race of beings, sometimes described as giants. They become disobedient or disorderly. Viracocha sends a devastating flood, often called Unu Pachacuti, a water-overturning or world-transforming flood. Most are destroyed. A few survive in mountain refuges, caves, or other protected places, depending on the version. Then the world is reordered. Viracocha travels across the land, bringing people forth, assigning communities their places, teaching them how to live. Here again, flood is not just disaster. It is a dividing line between an earlier, unstable age and a newly organized human world. but these accounts reached us through Spanish chroniclers, writing after conquest, often translating unfamiliar Andean ideas into Christian language. That does not erase the older tradition. It simply means the surviving texts must be read carefully. We are hearing indigenous memory through a difficult historical filter. In Amazonia, where rivers can expand across immense floodplains and transform the horizon into open water, many communities preserve narratives of inundation, escape and renewal. Yet Amazonian traditions are exceptionally diverse. Some stories tell of people surviving on high ground. Some involve ancestors escaping in canoes. Some explain why rivers, animals, or particular places look the way they do after primordial waters recede. It would be misleading to compress all of that into one Amazon flood myth. The landscape itself offers a powerful context. Seasonal rivers rise and fall dramatically. Forest becomes water. Water becomes forest. For communities living with that rhythm, flooding is not unimaginable cosmic chaos. It is part of the annual structure of life, enlarged in story until it becomes a memory of beginnings. North America offers another set of traditions, often shaped by lakes, rivers, and long winters. Among several peoples of the Great Lakes region, earth diver stories begin with a world covered in water. A culture hero, often known as Nanabozo in Anishinaabe traditions, survives a flood on a raft or floating refuge with animals. He asks the animals to dive beneath the water and bring up a little soil. One by one they fail. Finally, a small creature, sometimes muskrat, returns nearly lifeless, but carrying a tiny bit of earth. From that small amount of soil, land is formed again. It is a gentle but profound image. The world is restored not by the strongest animal, but by the smallest one willing to make the deepest sacrifice. And that may be the most important lesson in all these stories. Flood traditions do not have to be evidence for one global catastrophe to be meaningful. They can preserve local experiences of rivers, coasts, storms, and rising water. They can carry moral teachings about responsibility. They can explain why the world must be continually renewed. And through oral transmission, they can endure for centuries, changing in detail while retaining their deep shape. The waters crossed many worlds, but each people stood on their own shore. And beyond those American shores lies the largest ocean on Earth. The Pacific is so vast that on a map it can look empty. It is not empty. It is filled with islands, reefs, currents, migration routes, ancestral names and communities whose lives have always depended on reading water with extraordinary care. In Oceania, the sea is not simply a boundary around the world. It is a road, a source of food, a relative, a danger. And sometimes, in the oldest stories, it is the force that takes the land away. For island peoples, the idea of a world-destroying flood does not always mean water covering an entire planet. It can mean something more immediate. The beach where your grandparents gathered shellfish is gone. The freshwater pool has turned salty. A burial ground has collapsed into the surf. An island that once stood above the tide has become a reef, visible only when the sea is calm and the sun is high. That kind of loss can become a story, and a story can travel through generations long after the shoreline itself has disappeared. Across the Pacific, traditions describe drowned lands, islands, swallowed by the sea, ancestors escaping in canoes, and dangerous crossings over waters that were once thought impossible. These stories are not all the same. Polynesian, Micronesian, Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian traditions belong to many separate peoples, with their own languages, sacred histories and relationships to place. It would be just as misleading to call them one single Oceanian flood myth as it would be to call all American traditions one story. But water appears again and again because water was always there, at the edge of every settlement, changing the shape of life. In parts of Polynesia, stories tell of islands that sank because of human wrongdoing, spiritual conflict, or a breach of sacred order. In some traditions, a chief, a god, or an ancestor causes the sea to rise. In others, people flee a collapsing homeland and find a new island after a long and perilous voyage. These narratives can carry moral meaning. A drowned land may be a warning about arrogance, broken obligations, or disrespect toward the forces that sustain life. But they may also preserve something more practical. The memory that land is not permanent, that the sea can cross a reef, that a safe harbour can become dangerous, that survival may depend on knowing when to leave. This is especially important when we remember what happened after the last ice age. At its peak, around 20,000 years ago, enormous amounts of Earth's water were locked in glaciers. Sea levels were more than 100 metres lower than they are today. Coastlines stood far beyond their modern positions. Islands were larger. Some were connected to neighbouring islands. In places now covered by shallow ocean, there were coastal plains, rivers, wetlands, and camps where people lived. Then the ice began to melt, not in one single worldwide flood. Not as a single wave sweeping every coast at the same moment. But over thousands of years, the ocean rose, sometimes slowly enough for generations to adapt, sometimes in faster pulses as ice sheets destabilized and released vast volumes of water. For communities living near low coasts, a gradual rise could still feel like the end of a world. Imagine it happening not in a day, but across the lives of grandparents, parents, and children. Each generation notices the high tide reaching a little farther. Storms cut deeper into dunes. Familiar fishing grounds become submerged. A river mouth moves. A small island breaks apart. Eventually, the old place exists only in memory. And memory says, the sea took it. Australia offers some of the most fascinating examples. Aboriginal Australian peoples have maintained oral traditions connected to specific landscapes for immense spans of time. Along parts of the coast, stories describe areas now underwater, including former hunting grounds, islands joined to the mainland, and ancestral journeys across places that are today covered by sea. Researchers have suggested that some of these accounts may preserve memories of sea level rise that occurred thousands of years ago. This is an extraordinary possibility, but it needs to be handled carefully. Oral tradition is not a tape recording from prehistory. Stories are performed, retold, interpreted, and renewed. They carry lore, identity, ceremony, kinship, and spiritual knowledge. They can preserve environmental observations for very long periods, especially when tied closely to named places. But we cannot simply point to every story of drowned land and declare it a precise report of an event 8,000 years ago. Still, the match between some traditions and real submerged landscapes is difficult to dismiss entirely. In southern Australia, for example, stories from communities around Port Phillip Bay have been interpreted as recalling a time when the bay was dry land, crossed by a river before the sea entered and transformed it. Similar traditions occur near other drowned coastal zones. The details vary, the dates remain uncertain, but the larger pattern makes sense. People watched the coastline change, and they gave that change a place in memory. Then there are disasters that happen all at once. A tsunami is not sea level rise. It is not the patient advance of tides over centuries. It is a sudden wall or surge of water, usually caused by an undersea earthquake, volcanic eruption, or landslide. It can arrive with little warning. The sea may pull back strangely from the shore, exposing reef and sand. Then the water returns with terrifying force. Pacific communities have lived with this danger for millennia. In island traditions, Stories sometimes tell of immense waves that sweep away villages, of people who survive by climbing hills, of canoes carried inland, of a sea that behaves in ways no ordinary storm can explain. Along volcanic island chains and earthquake-prone coasts, these stories may reflect real experiences of tsunamis. The Pacific Ring of Fire has produced some of the most powerful earthquakes and eruptions in human history. But again, caution matters. A story about a giant wave may be a memory of a tsunami. It may also be a sacred account of creation, divine power, social disorder, or ancestral transformation. It can be more than one thing at once. Modern listeners often want a single answer, history or myth. But traditional stories do not always accept that division. They can contain practical knowledge inside sacred language. Do not build too close to the exposed shore. Watch the sea. Know the high ground. Respect the reef, the current, the season, the warning signs. And perhaps nowhere was such knowledge more necessary than in the long ocean crossings that settled the Pacific. The ancestors of Polynesian navigators crossed enormous distances without compasses, maps, or modern instruments. They read stars, swells, clouds, birds, drifting plants, and the subtle colour of water above reefs. The ocean was dangerous, but it was also known. A flood story in this world could be a story about escape. Yes, but it could also be about navigation, about leaving a lost homeland, about finding land when land itself has vanished behind the horizon. At the edge of the world, water was never only an ending. It was also the path to the next beginning, and as rising seas redrew coastlines from Australia to the farthest Pacific islands, they left behind a question that would echo in cultures everywhere. If the land beneath your ancestors is gone, where does the memory of that land survive? Sometimes in the sea, and sometimes in the story told beside it. And from the islands of the Pacific, we return to Africa. Not to the Nile Valley, with its famous annual inundation and its temples built beside the river, but to the rest of a continent so large that it contains deserts, rainforests, grasslands, high mountains, inland seas, and river systems vast enough to shape the lives of millions. Africa does not have one flood tradition. It has thousands of communities, hundreds of languages and oral histories tied to particular valleys, lakes, forests, and seasonal rains. A story told near the Niger River is not automatically connected to one told beside Lake Victoria. A tradition from the Ethiopian highlands does not speak for the Kalahari, and no single tale can stand in for an entire continent. But across many regions, water appears as a force of transformation. Sometimes it is sent by a creator. Sometimes it follows human arrogance, violence, broken rules, or disrespect for the natural order. Sometimes a person receives a warning. Sometimes a family escapes. Sometimes animals are gathered, and sometimes, after the waters withdraw, the survivors begin again in a world that has been cleaned, punished, or renewed. One of the better-known examples comes from Maasai tradition in East Africa. In versions recorded during the modern period, a righteous man named Tumbe Not is warned by the creator god, often called Enkai, that a great flood is coming. He builds a large vessel. He brings his family and animals inside. Water covers the land, and only those who prepared survive. The resemblance to Noah is obvious. Too obvious, perhaps. This is where the story becomes complicated. Many African traditions were first written down by missionaries, colonial officials, travellers, and anthropologists, often generations after Christian and Islamic ideas had entered local communities. A story recorded in the 19th or 20th century may contain older local elements, later religious influences, or both mixed together so completely that they cannot be separated with confidence. That does not make the story false. It means we should listen carefully before treating it as a message preserved unchanged from some distant prehistoric flood. Oral tradition is alive. It adapts, it absorbs, it gives new language to old concerns. And the concerns in these stories are often deeply local. In East Africa, rainfall can be generous, life-giving, and dangerous. Rivers rise quickly. Seasonal streams become violent torrents. Around the Great Lakes and the highlands, heavy rains can trigger floods and landslides. Lake shores move. Wetlands expand and contract. A long period of drought can be followed by rains so intense that dry ground cannot absorb them. For people living close to these cycles, water is never simply water. It is pasture, it is cattle, it is the difference between hunger and abundance. And when it comes too hard, too soon, it can erase the boundary between fertile ground and destruction. Further west, the Niger River follows one of the most remarkable courses on Earth. It bends across the Sahel and feeds the inland Niger Delta in Mali, where seasonal floodwaters spread over huge areas of grassland and marsh. The flood arrives not as an enemy from outside, but as part of the yearly rhythm that supports fishing, farming, grazing birds and animals. Yet, even a beneficial flood has limits. If rains fail, the wetlands shrink. If rains are too strong, settlements and crops are threatened. The same water that makes life possible can become a source of loss. This double meaning appears again and again in African relationships with rivers. Water is not always a punishment. Sometimes it is power that must be respected, managed, negotiated with, and understood. The Congo Basin offers another version of this reality. Here are forests crossed by immense rivers, tributaries, swamps, and lakes. In such a landscape, the world can change with a season. A river may overflow into forest. A familiar path may vanish. Villages may depend on canoes as much as roads. Flooding is not necessarily a rare apocalypse. It can be part of ordinary life, returning year after year, reshaping the ground beneath people's feet. And in the Sahel, the opposite danger is always nearby. For generations, communities have watched rains arrive late, fall briefly, or fail entirely. Then in another year, storms can break over hard, dry earth and turn shallow channels into sudden floods. This is one reason renewal stories matter so much. They are not only about water destroying a world, they are also about the return of balance after imbalance, the return of rain after dust, green shoots after emptiness, herds recovering, families rebuilding. A flood story can carry a moral lesson, certainly. Do not become cruel. Do not break obligations to one another. Do not offend the powers that sustain the land, but it can also carry practical memory. Know the river, know the season. Do not build where the water has flowed before. Keep food ready. Listen to elders who remember the last great rain. That last point matters because many flood accounts survive through retelling, not writing. Their exact age is often impossible to establish. A tale may preserve very old environmental knowledge, but it may also have been reshaped by recent disasters, migration, trade, conversion, and contact with neighbouring peoples. The temptation is to collect every African story involving rising water and arrange them into one enormous ancient puzzle. But the continent resists that kind of simplicity. Its rivers are different. Its climates are different. Its histories are different. What the stories share is not necessarily a single remembered flood. What they share may be something more universal. The knowledge that a human community is never fully separate from its water. A river can feed you for 1,000 seasons, then take your fields in one night. A lake can sustain a people, then rise over the shore. Rain can arrive as mercy, then become too much mercy. And after the waters fall, there is always the difficult work of beginning again. That idea would have been familiar to people far beyond Africa as well. because after the Ice Age, the waters of the world were not only flooding rivers and lakes, they were moving coastlines themselves. The waters were moving coastlines themselves. At the height of the last Ice Age, around 20,000 years ago, enormous quantities of Earth's water were locked away in glaciers and ice sheets. Ice covered much of northern Europe, Canada, and the high mountains of the world. So much water had been taken out of the oceans that sea level was far lower than it is today. Not a few feet lower, more than 120 meters lower in some estimates. That is roughly the height of a 35-story building. And when the sea is 120 meters lower, the map of the world looks very different. The shallow edges of continents become dry land. Wide coastal plains emerge where there are now waves. Islands connect to mainlands. River valleys extend far beyond their modern mouths. Places that today lie beneath the North Sea. The Persian Gulf, the Yellow Sea, and the waters of Southeast Asia were once open landscapes, crossed by animals and inhabited by people. For hunter-gatherers living near the coast, these were not empty margins of the world. They may have been some of the best places to live. Coasts offer fish, shellfish, birds, seals, freshwater streams, wetlands, and rich hunting grounds. Rivers bring animals and people together. Estuaries can provide food through every season. A broad coastal plain, watered by rivers and close to the sea, might support communities for thousands of years. But then the climate warmed, not smoothly, not gently, and not at the same speed everywhere. As the great ice sheets began to melt, their water returned to the oceans. Century after century, the sea rose. In some periods, it may have advanced slowly enough for a family to notice only that the shoreline had moved a little farther inland than it had been in their grandparents' time. In other periods, during faster pulses of meltwater, change could have been much more dramatic. A marsh becomes a tidal flat. A river mouth becomes an inlet. A familiar hunting ground turns into a shallow bay. And eventually, land that had been walked, named, buried in, and remembered disappears beneath the water. One of the clearest examples is Doggerland. Today, Doggerland lies beneath the North Sea, between Britain and mainland Europe. Fishing boats occasionally pull up bones, peat, ancient tools and fragments of the lost world from the seabed. But during the Ice Age and the millennia after it, this was not sea. It was a huge lowland plain. Rivers crossed it. Lakes and marshes dotted the landscape. Herds of animals moved through it. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived there, following seasonal resources across country that is now covered by cold grey water. Britain itself was not always an island. For a long time, people could walk from what is now England into the wider European mainland. Then the sea kept rising. The English Channel widened. Lowlands vanished. The routes of migration changed. Communities that had once been connected by land found themselves separated by water. Doggerland did not disappear in a single afternoon. Much of its drowning took place over thousands of years. But for the people living there, slow change does not mean insignificant change. A coastline advancing a few meters each year can still transform an entire way of life within a handful of generations. And in some places the final losses may have come suddenly. Around 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide off Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami that struck parts of the North Atlantic coast. It likely flooded already vulnerable areas of Doggerland. By then much of the plain had been swallowed by rising seas, but this event may have been one terrible chapter in its final disappearance. Far to the southeast, another drowned world stretched across what is now Indonesia and Malaysia. During the Ice Age, the sea was low enough that Sumatra, Java, Borneo and mainland Southeast Asia were joined into a vast region called Sunda Land, or the Sunda Shelf. It contained wide plains, river systems, forests, and wetlands. The modern Java Sea was dry land, so were large areas now divided by shallow tropical water. Imagine living there as the Ice Age ended. The rivers change course. Salt water reaches farther upstream. Forests near the shore become mangroves. Old campsites vanish. A journey that once took a day on foot eventually requires a boat, if it can be made at all. For people whose lives depended on seasonal movement, fishing, hunting, and kinship ties across a broad landscape, this would not have been an abstract geological process. It would have been the world becoming smaller. This is where flood stories become especially interesting. Could oral traditions preserve memories of rising seas over very long periods? Possibly. Oral knowledge can be remarkably durable when it is tied to practical survival. A story about land lost beyond the present shore might remind later generations where fish once gathered, where ancestors travelled, or why a dangerous channel should be respected. In Australia, some researchers have suggested that certain indigenous traditions describing former coastal land and rising waters may preserve memories from thousands of years ago, when post-Ice Age seas reshaped the shoreline. The idea is plausible, but difficult to prove in any individual case. Oral traditions change as they are passed on. They can preserve ancient landscapes, but they can also absorb later storms, local floods, religious meanings, and new historical experiences. So we should be careful. A story about the sea covering land does not automatically give us a precise date. It does not automatically point to one specific event. And it certainly does not prove that every flood tradition on Earth came from a single worldwide disaster. Global sea level rise after the Ice Age was real. It was enormous. It transformed coastlines on every continent. But it happened across many thousands of years, differently in different places, with local storms, tsunamis, river floods, and tectonic changes adding their own disasters to the story. There was no single morning when all humanity woke to one universal wall of water. There were many coastlines, many communities, many generations watching the edge of their world move inland. And for some of them, perhaps, the memory survived in a story. Once, our ancestors lived where the sea is now. But slow water is only part of the story. A shoreline can creep inland over centuries, taking one field, one marsh, one burial ground at a time. And then, on a perfectly ordinary day, water can arrive all at once. Not rising politely through the riverbanks, not giving people generations to move uphill. A wall of water, a roaring surge, a river suddenly turned into something wider than memory. For communities living near coasts, rivers, lakes, and mountains, these sudden floods may have been among the most terrifying events imaginable. They did not need to cover the whole earth to feel like the end of everything. They only had to destroy the world a community knew. Tsunamis are perhaps the clearest example. Most are caused by earthquakes beneath the sea, when a section of the ocean floor jolts upward or downward and displaces an enormous volume of water. Far offshore, a tsunami may be hard to notice. Its wave can be long and low, racing across the ocean at the speed of a jet aircraft. But when it reaches shallow water near land, everything changes. The wave slows, its energy piles upward, water rushes onto shore, sometimes as a towering breaker, sometimes as a fast, relentless flood that pours through forests, villages, and river mouths. It can carry boats inland, tear houses from their foundations, strip soil from fields, and leave salt water in wells and farmland long after the sea has pulled back. And it may not come only once. A first wave can draw people toward the exposed seabed, curious about fish flopping on the sand, or ships resting strangely on their sides. Then another surge arrives, and another, For ancient people without seismographs, warning sirens, or maps of tectonic plates, the cause would have been invisible. The earth shakes, the sea retreats. Then the sea returns with impossible violence. It is not difficult to understand how that experience could become a story of warning, judgment, survival, and renewal. We can sometimes see the traces of such disasters in the ground. A tsunami may leave a thin layer of sand far inland, sitting above dark soil or peat formed in a freshwater marsh. Within that sand, geologists can find tiny shells, marine microorganisms called foraminifera, fragments of coral, or chemical signatures of salt water. In some places, huge coastal boulders appear to have been pushed far above normal wave reach, though interpreting those boulders can be complicated. Powerful storms can move rocks too. The evidence has to be assembled carefully. One strange sand layer is interesting, but a sand layer that extends across a wide landscape, contains material from the sea, appears above an ancient living surface, and can be dated to the same time at multiple sites becomes much more persuasive. That is how researchers have investigated events like the Storegga tsunami, the great North Atlantic wave mentioned before. Around 8,200 years ago, an underwater collapse off the coast of Norway sent waves across parts of Scotland, Norway and the North Sea basin. Sediment deposits in coastal wetlands suggest water reached far inland in some areas. For anyone living on low ground, especially in the remaining wetlands of Deucalion, the experience may have been beyond comprehension. The sea did not just rise, it attacked. But coasts are not the only places where water can become suddenly dangerous. Consider the storm surge. A storm surge is not simply a large wave. It is a broad dome of ocean water pushed toward land by the winds and low pressure of a powerful cyclone or hurricane. If it arrives at high tide, it can raise the sea by several meters, flooding deltas and low islands with astonishing speed. The danger is especially severe where flat land lies only a little above sea level. In places such as the Bay of Bengal, a surge can travel far inland through river channels and across fields. A village may survive the wind only to be overwhelmed by water afterward, and unlike a tsunami, a storm surge does not require a rare earthquake. Storms come again and again, seasons repeat. Communities rebuild in the same fertile coastal places because the land and water provide so much food. Then, one year, the storm is stronger, the tide higher, the warning missed or impossible to understand. The sea enters the houses, the rice stores spoil, the freshwater ponds turn salty. Survival becomes not just a matter of escaping the first flood, but of enduring the hungry months that follow. Monsoon systems can create a different kind of disaster. A failed monsoon may first bring drought, rivers shrink. Crops fail, families use stored grain and wait for rain that does not come. Then, when the seasonal rains finally return, hard, dry ground may be unable to absorb the water. Dry channels become torrents, hillsides collapse, rivers burst across floodplains. To people dependent on the rhythm of the rains, water can be both life and destruction, sometimes in the same year. Then there are floods born in mountains. Glaciers often dam lakes of meltwater with walls of ice, rock, or loose sediment. These lakes can look calm for years, but if the dam fails through melting, erosion, an avalanche, or an earthquake, the stored water escapes all at once. This is called a glacial lake outburst flood. Imagine a lake draining down a narrow valley with the force of a moving mountain. It tears away trees, carries boulders, destroys bridges, and reshapes river channels in hours. Long after the water is gone, it can leave strange scars across the landscape, gravel ridges, giant ripples of sediment, displaced rocks, and channels far too large for the small stream now flowing through them. Ancient natural dam failures could be just as devastating. Landslides can block rivers, creating lakes behind them. When the blockage finally breaks, the released water races downstream. Volcanic eruptions can do something similar, melting snow and ice into floods called lahars, thick with mud, ash, and shattered rock. These events are local in a geological sense, but human beings do not live at a geological scale. A small farming valley can be an entire universe. It contains the fields of grandparents, the graves of ancestors, the paths children walk, the river that gives water, the sacred hill, the neighbouring villages, the only trade route anyone has ever known. If a flood destroys all of it, and the survivors escape by climbing a ridge or finding refuge in a boat, what word would they use for what happened? Not regional inundation, not hydrological catastrophe. They might say the world was destroyed, and from where they stood looking down at roofs, trees, animals and bodies, carried away in brown water, they would not be wrong. This is the emotional structure behind so many flood stories. There is a world before the waters. There are warnings ignored or understood too late. A small number survive, often through unusual knowledge, preparation, luck, or divine help. Then comes the terrible silence after the water falls. The survivors step onto altered ground. They must begin again. That pattern does not prove that every myth records one particular tsunami, storm surge, or lake burst, but it helps explain why real disasters are so easily transformed into sacred memory. Sudden water creates a natural story shape. It divides time into before and after, and one of the most dramatic attempts to connect real water disasters with ancient flood memory begins at a narrow channel between Europe and Asia. The Bosporus. Today, it is a busy waterway running through Istanbul, linking the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, the Aegean, and beyond that, the Mediterranean. Ferries cross it, cargo ships pass through it, millions of people live along its banks. But after the last ice age, this narrow passage may have been the site of something extraordinary. The idea became famous in the 1990s when geologists William Bryan and Walter Pittman proposed what came to be called the Black Sea Flood hypothesis. Their basic argument was simple, dramatic, and immediately unforgettable. As the great ice sheets melted, global sea levels rose. The Mediterranean expanded eventually, according to the hypothesis. Mediterranean water reached the natural barrier at the Bosporus. Then it broke through, not as a gentle tide, as a massive inflow. In this version of events, the Black Sea basin had been a much smaller freshwater lake lying below the level of the Mediterranean. Once the barrier failed, salt water poured through the Bosporus and rushed into the basin. Shorelines moved rapidly inland, low-lying land disappeared. Communities living around the old lake edge may have watched familiar ground vanish beneath advancing water. Picture this. You live beside a broad freshwater lake. Your people fish its shallows, gather reeds along its marshes, farm the fertile ground near the shore. The lake has always been there. Its boundaries seem as permanent as the hills. Then, perhaps over days, months, or years, depending on which version of the theory you accept, the water begins rising in a way no seasonal flood ever has. It does not stop at the usual banks. It climbs through fields. It swallows camps. It cuts off paths to neighbouring settlements. Fresh water becomes brackish. Fish change. The horizon itself moves farther away as the lake becomes a sea. For people who escaped, the memory would not be about a geological basin connected to another basin. It would be about the day the world drowned. This was why the hypothesis attracted so much attention. It seemed to offer a possible real event behind the emotional force of flood traditions from the wider Near East. The timing suggested by early versions of the theory, roughly 7,600 years ago, fell within the long prehistoric period before the earliest written Mesopotamian flood stories. Perhaps, some wondered, displaced people had carried memories southward and eastward. Perhaps those memories changed across generations, eventually becoming stories of divine warnings, boats, animals, and chosen survivors. Some popular accounts went further. They suggested that the Black Sea flood might be the historical seed of Noah's flood. It is an appealing idea, a real inundation, a devastated farming population, refugees moving into new lands, a disaster remembered for thousands of years until it entered myth. But appealing is not the same as proven, and this is where the story becomes more interesting than a simple yes or no. The Black Sea flood hypothesis has been debated for decades because the evidence is difficult to interpret. The bottom of the Black Sea preserves layers of sediment, ancient shorelines, shells, pollen, and traces of changing water chemistry. These clues can tell researchers whether the basin was fresher or saltier at different times, whether shorelines were lower, and when Mediterranean water entered. But they do not always tell one clear story. Some findings support the basic idea that major environmental change occurred as sea levels rose after the Ice Age. There is strong evidence that the Black Sea changed from a largely freshwater environment into the brackish and marine-connected sea we know today. Ancient landscapes now lie underwater around parts of its coast. The people who lived there would certainly have faced changing shorelines. The disagreement is about how fast, how catastrophic, and exactly when. Did Mediterranean water burst through the Bosporus in a sudden roaring torrent? Or was there already some connection between the seas, with water levels changing more gradually over centuries? Did the Black Sea rise quickly enough to force large populations from their homes? Or did the shoreline advance slowly enough for communities to retreat generation by generation? These are not small details. They decide whether we are looking at a single terrifying flood event or a long and complicated process of post-Ice Age sea level change. Some researchers argue that the evidence points to a rapid inflow, though perhaps not as sudden or immense as the earliest dramatic description suggested. Others believe the Black Sea and Mediterranean may have exchanged water earlier than the hypothesis allows. Still others emphasize that local conditions varied around such a large basin. One coast might have changed slowly, while a low river valley experienced severe flooding. Then there is the archaeological problem. If villages were drowned along an ancient shoreline, their remains may now lie beneath deep water and thick layers of sediment. Finding them is difficult. Underwater archaeology has identified ancient structures and shipwrecks in the Black Sea region, but direct evidence for a vast population fleeing one specific flood remains limited. And even if such a migration happened, connecting it directly to later flood myths would be another step entirely. Stories travel, people travel, but stories also change, combine, and acquire new meanings. A flood remembered by one community may become a warning about morality in another. It may become a tale of kingship, divine anger, cosmic renewal, or the survival of sacred knowledge. So the Black Sea hypothesis is not evidence for a global deluge. It does not show that all ancient cultures remembered one flood at the same time. It describes at most a possible regional inundation in one part of the world, during a period when seas were rising almost everywhere. But that is still important, because a regional flood can be enormous to the people inside it. And the debate itself shows how science works when it meets a powerful historical idea. A dramatic proposal appears, new cores are drilled, shells are dated, ancient shorelines are mapped. Computer models test how water might have moved through the Bosporus. Archaeologists search for drowned settlements. The original story is challenged, revised, narrowed, and sometimes strengthened in unexpected ways. Science does not become less valuable when it complicates a beautiful theory. it becomes more valuable. The real past is rarely as neat as a legend. But it can be stranger, slower, more violent, and more human than the legend ever imagined. And whether the Black Sea rose in a sudden catastrophe, or through a long advance of water, its ancient shores remind us of something essential. For people living at the edge of a changing world, the difference between a rising sea and the end of everything may be only a few steps uphill. And that brings us to a quieter possibility. Maybe some flood stories did not begin independently at all. Maybe they travelled, not across the whole planet in one ancient chain of memory, not from one original boat to every distant shore, but from community to community, carried by merchants, migrants, prisoners, priests, and storytellers. A tale told beside one river could move down a trade route. It could cross a mountain pass with a marriage alliance. It could survive the collapse of a city, carried away by refugees who had lost everything except the stories that explained what had happened to them. This is not speculation in every case. In the ancient Near East, we can actually watch related flood traditions appearing in written form. Mesopotamia gives us some of the oldest surviving examples. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood. One god secretly warns Atrahasis, instructing him to build a boat and preserve life. In the later epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor is called Utnapishtim. He receives a warning, builds a great vessel, brings living creatures aboard, survives the waters, releases birds to search for land, and offers a sacrifice when the flood ends. And then there is the biblical story of Noah, a divine decision to send a flood. A chosen man warned in advance, detailed instructions for a large vessel. Family members preserved, animals gathered, rain and rising water. Birds sent out over the drowned landscape. A sacrifice after survival. And finally a promise that this kind of destruction will not be repeated. The similarities are hard to ignore. They do not mean that the biblical account is simply a copied version of Gilgamesh, with the names changed. The stories differ in important ways. Their gods have different motives. Their heroes have different relationships with the divine. Their endings make different moral claims. In Atrahasis, humanity is threatened partly because people have become too numerous and too noisy for the gods to tolerate. In Gilgamesh, the flood is part of a larger meditation on mortality, loss, and the unreachable promise of eternal life. In Genesis, the flood becomes a story about violence, corruption, judgment, covenant, and the possibility of a renewed world. But they belong to the same broad neighbourhood of ideas. And this is where cultural contact matters. Ancient Mesopotamia was not isolated. For thousands of years, its cities traded with Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, Iran, the Arabian Peninsula, and regions far beyond. Timber came down from mountain lands, metals arrived from distant mines, stone, shells, incense, textiles, grain, and luxury goods passed through the hands of traders speaking different languages. Where goods travelled, stories could travel too. A merchant might hear a tale in a tavern beside the Euphrates and repeat it months later on the Mediterranean coast. A scribe might copy an old tablet in one city, then carry its language and images to another. Royal courts exchanged gifts, letters, hostages, and experts. Armies moved across enormous distances. Conquest brought populations together under the same empire. Deportation forced people from their homes and placed them among unfamiliar customs. The ancient world was full of movement, and the history of Israel itself includes periods of intense contact with Mesopotamian powers. The Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. The Babylonian Empire conquered Judah, destroyed Jerusalem, and carried many Judean elites into exile in Babylon during the 6th century BCE. That Babylonian context is especially important when scholars compare Genesis with Mesopotamian literature. By then, flood stories such as Atrahasis and Gilgamesh had existed in written traditions for centuries. Babylonian scribes preserved, copied and adapted old texts. Judean writers and scholars living in or connected to Babylon would have encountered a civilization with deep literary archives and powerful ideas about creation, kingship, catastrophe, and divine justice. This does not prove that one person sat down with a copy of Gilgamesh and wrote Noah's story as a response. History is rarely that tidy, but it makes cultural influence entirely plausible. The biblical flood narrative may preserve older West Semitic traditions, may draw on shared oral stories from the wider Near East, may respond deliberately to Mesopotamian versions, or may combine all of these things at once. Stories do not need to be copied word for word to be related. They can be inherited, argued with, reshaped, and given a new purpose. In fact, one of the most striking features of the Noah story may be how it transforms the older flood pattern. Mesopotamian gods can appear divided, impulsive, even alarmed by the scale of their own destruction. In Genesis, there is one God, and the flood becomes morally serious. Human violence matters. The covenant after the flood matters. The rainbow matters. The world is not merely reset. It is given an ethical promise that feels less like simple borrowing and more like conversation across centuries. But now we have to be careful. The fact that Mesopotamian and biblical flood traditions are closely connected does not mean every flood story everywhere came from Mesopotamia. A story from Greece may have travelled through the eastern Mediterranean. A story from Anatolia may reflect contact with neighbouring peoples. Indian traditions developed within vast networks of their own, connected by trade and migration, but also shaped by local religious thought. And flood traditions in the Americas, Oceania, sub-Saharan Africa, or Northern Europe may preserve completely different experiences, different landscapes, and different meanings. Similarity is evidence to examine, not a shortcut to certainty. Two stories can resemble each other because people met and exchanged ideas. That is diffusion. But they can also resemble each other because floods are common, terrifying, and easy to turn into a story about survival. That is independent invention. If a river rises over its banks year after year, people do not need contact with Babylon to imagine a flood that covers the whole world. If a coastal community watches a storm surge destroy homes and graves, it does not need to know Noah or Utnapishtim to tell of a chosen family escaping by boat. Human beings everywhere have seen water erase boundaries. They have seen rain become danger. They have watched a familiar landscape disappear. And once a culture asks why such a thing happened, the answers can become surprisingly similar. The gods were angry. People had forgotten the rules. One wise person listened. A small remnant survived. The world began again. These are powerful ideas because they fit powerful experiences. So the question is not whether flood myths travelled, or whether they arose independently. Both almost certainly happened. In some places we can trace literary family resemblance with remarkable confidence. In others we can only say that different peoples faced the same ancient terror and gave it a shape that made sense in their own world. The waters may have been local, but the human need to remember them was everywhere. And that human need leads to an even deeper question. Why do floods so often become sacred stories? Why not simply stories about bad weather, broken riverbanks, lost villages, and terrible luck? Because water is never just water to the people who depend on it. A river gives drinking water, fish, fertile soil, and a path through the landscape. Seasonal rains fill wells, green the fields, and bring animals back to familiar grazing grounds. In dry country, water can mean survival itself. A spring is not just a spring. It is the difference between life and death. But water has another side. The same river that feeds a city can take it apart in a single night. The same rain that saves the crops can become a storm that tears roofs from houses and carries children away. The sea provides food, travel, trade, and connection. Then one surge comes ashore, and the coastline is unrecognizable. Water crosses boundaries. It ignores walls. It fills roads. It enters homes, temples, tombs, storehouses, and palaces. Fire destroys what it touches. Water can destroy everything, while leaving the shape of the world still visible beneath it. Trees still stand, hills still rise, but the familiar ground has vanished under a moving surface. That makes floods uniquely powerful in the imagination. They look like chaos returning. In many ancient creation stories, the world begins with water. Not ordinary water exactly, but a vast, dark, undivided deep. Before fields, before cities, before human rules and named places, there is water everywhere. Creation means separating it, raising land from it, making borders between sea and shore, river and field, sky and earth. A flood reverses that process. The boundaries disappear again. Land becomes sea, roads become channels, houses become islands, then vanish. The ordered human world with its farms, laws, temples and family lines seems to dissolve back into something older and more formless. So, when ancient people described a great flood, they were often describing more than physical destruction. They were describing the collapse of order itself. That is why flood stories can become stories of judgment. If the world is drowned, someone will ask what the people did wrong. Were they violent, greedy, noisy, disobedient? Had rulers failed in their duties? Had rituals been neglected? Had humans broken an agreement with the gods, the ancestors, or the living land? These questions do not mean that every community thought flood victims deserved their fate. Real disaster can inspire compassion as much as blame. But myths are not emergency reports. They are ways of thinking through unbearable events. They ask whether catastrophe has meaning, because the alternative can be even more frightening. Maybe the waters rose for no reason. Maybe there was no warning. No justice, no lesson, just loss. A sacred story gives disaster a shape. It says the flood came because the old world had become corrupted, or because cosmic balance had been disturbed, or because a divine being decided humanity needed to change. In some traditions, the disaster is not mainly punishment at all. It is a cleansing, a renewal, a terrible clearing away before life can begin again. This is where the survivor becomes so important. Flood myths rarely end with drowning. They end with the boat, the mountain, the raft, the sealed vessel, the hidden cave, the family that escapes, the animals preserved, the seeds carried forward. Even in the darkest version, something survives. A remnant remains. That remnant is more than a group of lucky people. It becomes the bridge between two worlds. There was the world before the waters. Then there was the world after. The survivors explain how the people now living came to be here. They established descent, authority, ritual, and belonging. A family that survives may become the ancestor of a whole people. A wise ruler who controls the flood may gain the right to rule. A figure who obeys divine instructions may become an example of faithfulness. A community that endures may tell itself and its children that it has lived through destruction before. That kind of story can preserve identity after trauma. Imagine a village scattered by a sudden flood, homes gone, fields buried, elders dead, families forced to move to unfamiliar ground. In the years afterward, people would need more than food and shelter. They would need to explain who they still were. The story could say, "We were not erased. Our ancestors crossed the waters. They carried the sacred fire. The old names, the remembered laws, the seeds for the next planting. They found land again. They rebuilt. And because they rebuilt, we are here. That is not merely mythology in the dismissive modern sense. It is social memory doing essential work. It turns survival into inheritance. It can also turn survival into a warning. If the old world was destroyed by pride, violence, or neglect, then the new world must live differently. The flood becomes a moral boundary marker. Before it, people failed. After it, there are new obligations. A covenant. A law. A king's duty to control the waters. A ritual duty to honour the powers that keep rivers within their banks. And sometimes the lesson is political in China. The story of Yu the Great is not about escaping a flood in a boat. It is about mastering it through labour, engineering, persistence, and the ability to organise society. Yu gains authority because he succeeds where others fail. The story links control of water with legitimate rule. In Egypt, the Nile flood could be dangerous, but its regular return was also the foundation of agricultural life. There, water was not simply an enemy to defeat. It was part of a sacred cycle. Too little was disaster, too much was disaster, but the right flood renewed the land. Different landscapes created different sacred meanings, and that matters. A Mesopotamian city on a volatile river plain, an island community facing the sea, a people living beside a seasonal monsoon river, and a farming society dependent on an annual inundation could all speak of flood. Yet they would not necessarily mean the same thing. For one, flood might mean divine judgment. For another, it might mean the untamed force that a good ruler must manage. For another, it might mean the return of fertility. For another, it might be the memory of a coast lost beneath rising water, transformed across generations into a tale of ancestors fleeing an advancing sea. Symbolic meaning does not cancel the possibility of real events. In fact, the two can strengthen each other. A devastating flood happens. People remember the terror, the warning signs, the desperate escape, the high ground, the missing relatives. Over generations, the details shift. Names change. The local river becomes the whole world. A storm becomes a decision of the gods. One surviving household becomes the beginning of all humanity. That does not make the story worthless as memory. It tells us that the event mattered enough to outlive the people who saw it. But it also tells us something else. Human beings do not preserve disasters like cameras. We preserve them like storytellers. We weave experience together with fear, hope, morality, ancestry, and the great unanswered question of why the world can be so generous one season and so cruel the next. And that is why similar flood stories can feel connected, even when they come from very different places. Not because every culture necessarily remembered one single drowned world, but because everywhere water had the power to make people ask the same ancient question. When the world is washed away, what must be saved so that life can begin again? That question can tempt us toward a very simple answer. Maybe every flood story is a memory of the same flood. It is a powerful idea, a little too powerful sometimes. You have probably seen the lists. 100 flood myths, 200 flood myths. Stories from Mesopotamia, the Bible, Greece, India, China, the Pacific Islands, North America, South America, Africa, Northern Europe. Different names, different gods, but apparently the same basic plot. A wicked world, a warning, a chosen survivor, a boat, animals, a mountain, a new beginning, and once the list gets long enough, the conclusion can seem unavoidable. How could so many people invent something so similar unless they all remembered one real, world-destroying event? But this is where we need to slow down, because flood story is a very broad category. Broader than it first appears, a river overflowing its banks is a flood. A tsunami is a flood. A storm surge is a flood. Rising sea levels swallowing a coast over generations can become a flood in memory. A myth in which a god covers one valley with water may be called a flood story. So may a story about the whole earth returning to the primeval sea. Put all of those together, and yes, nearly every part of the world has stories involving destructive water. But that does not mean they are all telling the same story. The differences are not small details. They are often the most important part. In Mesopotamian stories, the gods decide to destroy humanity, though the reasons change between versions. One survivor is warned. He builds a great vessel. The flood is cosmic in scale, and the story asks what it means for fragile humans to live beneath unpredictable divine powers. In the biblical story, Noah's flood becomes a moral drama about violence, judgment, obedience, and covenant. The story ends not just with survival, but with a promise. The rainbow matters as much as the ark. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive, but the renewal of humanity takes a strange and symbolic form. They cast stones behind them, and those stones become people. That is not a memory of repopulating the earth with livestock and stored seeds. It is a story about regeneration, about human beings emerging from the bones of the earth. In India, Manu is warned by a fish, often identified with Vishnu. He preserves life through a cycle of destruction and renewal. The flood is part of a much larger vision of time, where worlds are created, dissolved, and created again. And in China, the central flood tradition is often not about one family escaping the end of the world at all. It is about generations struggling to control a disastrous inundation. Gun fails. Yu succeeds by channeling the waters. The lesson is practical, political, and moral. A ruler earns legitimacy by bringing order to the landscape. These stories share water. They sometimes share survival. But their causes, their scale, their chronology, their survivors, and their purpose can be radically different. Some floods are sent because people have become violent. Some happen because gods are angry. Some are part of a cosmic cycle. Some are not clearly punishment at all. Some survivors build boats. Some climb mountains, some hide in caves. Some are saved by animals. Some stories have no chosen survivor whatsoever. The water recedes, and people simply endure. Even the supposedly universal detail of animals entering a boat is not universal. Neither is the idea that every human being died except one family. Neither is the idea of a single flood covering the entire earth. Those features are especially prominent in a small group of traditions from the ancient Near East, and in stories influenced by them. They should not automatically be projected onto every narrative involving water from every continent. And there is another problem. The lists themselves are often misleading. Popular collections tend to select the stories that sound most like Noah or Utnapishtim. If an account mentions a boat, a mountain, or a divine warning, it gets included. If it describes a local river disaster, a coastal migration, or a seasonal inundation without a dramatic chosen survivor, it may be ignored. This is selection bias. You begin by searching the world for stories that resemble a familiar flood narrative. Then you place only the strongest similarities side by side. Finally, you are surprised that the collection looks similar. It is like collecting every story from around the world involving a hero who defeats a dangerous animal, then announcing that all cultures remembered the same monster. The comparison can still be meaningful, but it has to be handled carefully. There is also the history of how many stories were recorded. For centuries, missionaries, colonial officials, travellers, and later ethnographers asked indigenous communities about their beliefs. Often they came from cultures shaped by the biblical flood story. They knew what they were looking for. They asked questions about a great deluge, a boat, animals, punishment, and survival. Sometimes communities shared older traditions that genuinely involved flood. Sometimes interpreters translated local stories into familiar biblical language. Sometimes later, writers simplified complicated oral traditions until they sounded more like Noah. This does not mean the traditions were invented by missionaries. That would be unfair, and often plainly wrong. Many flood narratives were recorded independently, and many have deep roots in local languages, ritual and landscape. But it does mean the record is not neutral. A story told in an indigenous language, written down by a visitor, translated into a European language, edited for a book, and repeated in a popular list, has passed through many hands. At every stage, details can shift, so the careful conclusion is not that flood stories prove one global catastrophe. And it is not that similarities mean nothing. The truth may be more interesting than either extreme. Human communities lived beside dangerous rivers, lakes, coasts, and monsoon plains. They experienced real disasters. They watched water erase familiar worlds. They passed memories of those events to their children. Ideas also travelled between neighbouring societies, sometimes across astonishing distances. And human beings facing loss repeatedly gave flood the same kinds of meaning: judgment, renewal, survival, and the beginning of a new world. Many origins, many waters, many stories shaped by memory, imagination, and the landscapes where people lived. The question then is not whether every flood myth came from one event. It is what each story may still preserve from the world that gave it life. Maybe the answer is not hidden in one lost ocean, one drowned continent, or one impossible storm that covered every mountain on Earth. Maybe it is hidden in the places where people chose to live. Because for most of human history, water was life. Rivers gave people fish, fertile soil, drinking water, and routes for travel. Lakes supported settlements. Coasts offered shellfish, sea mammals, trade, and access to distant lands. Floodplains could produce harvests so rich that entire cities rose beside them. But water never signed a contract. The same river that fed a village could take it away in a single night. The same coast that provided food could be swallowed by a storm surge. The same seasonal rains that made agriculture possible could fail for years, then return with enough force to tear houses from the ground. Ancient people understood this better than most of us do. They did not need satellite images to know that settlements beside water were fragile. They could see the evidence around them: fields buried beneath silt, boats thrown into trees, old walls standing far from a river that had changed course, shells on land that no longer touched the sea, a grandparent pointing toward the water and saying, "There used to be houses there." That is one thing flood stories may truly preserve. Not necessarily a precise report of one event, with a date, a water level, and a map. Oral tradition does not work like a modern archive. Over generations, names change, places merge. A flood that affected one valley can grow until it fills the known world. A real survivor can become the ancestor of all humanity. A practical escape by boat can become a sacred vessel carrying seeds, animals, laws, and the future itself. But the memory of danger can remain. Environmental evidence shows that the world after the last ice age was a world of enormous change. Glaciers melted, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters over thousands of years. Coastlines moved inland, low plains disappeared, river systems shifted. In some places, these changes were gradual on a geological clock, but fast enough, across human lifetimes, for communities to notice that the edge of the world was moving. For people living on drowned coastal plains, the sea may not have felt gradual at all. It may have arrived in stages. A storm destroys one settlement. A generation later, the lagoon reaches the old hunting grounds. Another generation later, The graves of ancestors are under salt water. Eventually only fishing grounds remain, and a story once. There was land out there. Then there were the sudden disasters. Tsunamis, lake outburst floods, cyclones, flash floods in narrow valleys, rivers breaking through natural barriers, earthquakes pushing water onto shore. These events could transform a landscape in hours. They could kill hundreds or thousands of people in communities with no written records. And unlike a slow rise in sea level, they would leave behind exactly the kind of memory that stories hold on to. Darkness, roaring water, people climbing hills, families separated, a few survivors emerging into a changed world. So yes, some flood traditions may contain distant echoes of real catastrophes. But that does not mean we can take every detail literally. When a story says the whole world drowned, we have to ask whose world? For a farming community in a river basin, the world might mean the fields, villages, temples and towns within the horizon. For an island people it might mean every place reachable by canoe. For a city surrounded by floodwater, it might mean everything that mattered had vanished beneath the surface. A local flood can be a world flood to those living through it. And then there is the movement of stories themselves. The ancient Near East gives us the clearest example. Flood narratives appear in Mesopotamian literature long before the biblical version was written in its final form. The stories are not identical, but the family resemblance is difficult to miss. Divine decision, warning, vessel, preservation, release of birds, survival after overwhelming water. Ideas travelled through trade, conquest, migration, diplomacy, and exile. Stories travelled with them. This is not proof that one tale was simply copied from another. Traditions change when they enter new languages and new religious worlds, but it does show that flood stories could move across cultures, carrying old narrative patterns into new settings. And even where no historical connection can be demonstrated, human imagination often returns to water for the same reason. Water destroys boundaries. It covers roads, homes, fields, and graves. It turns solid ground into uncertainty. It erases the familiar shape of a place. In that sense, flood is not only a disaster, it is a perfect symbol for chaos itself. Before creation, many ancient traditions imagined a world of water. After destruction, water returns. Then, from the retreating flood, a new order begins. That pattern appears again and again because it speaks to something deep in human experience. Loss can feel like the end of the world. Survival can feel like a second creation. A family stepping from a boat, a mountain refuge, or a flooded house is not just alive. They are standing at the beginning of time again. This is why ancient flood stories recorded meaning as well as events. They asked why disaster happens. They asked who deserves to survive. They asked whether the gods, nature, rulers, or human beings themselves could restore order. They preserved fear but also instruction. Build wisely. Listen to warnings, respect the river, do not trust prosperity to last forever. Remember that civilization depends on forces it cannot fully control. Can we identify one original flood behind all these stories? No, the evidence does not allow it. Can we prove that every tradition is only symbolic, with no memory of real water behind it? No. That claim would be too simple too. What survives is a layered record. Real floods, rising seas, travelling stories, sacred imagination. Generations living beside waters that nourished them, threatened them, and sometimes took everything away. The central mystery remains open, but perhaps that is fitting. Flood stories are not maps leading us back to one vanished day. They are messages carried forward from countless shores, riverbanks, and drowned landscapes. and they remind us that the boundary between a safe home and a lost world has always been thinner than it seems. And perhaps that is why these stories have lasted so long. Not because every ancient people received a perfect account of one single worldwide catastrophe, passed unchanged from generation to generation. The evidence does not support that. Human communities were separated by oceans, mountains, languages, and thousands of years. Their flood stories differ in crucial ways. Different survivors, different gods, different landscapes, different reasons for destruction, different visions of what comes after. But across that enormous distance, a pattern remains. Again and again, people remembered water rising beyond its ordinary limits. They remembered a warning, or the terrible absence of one. They remembered a boat, a mountain, a tree, a raft, a cave, a floating house, a person who listened, a family that escaped, animals carried away, fields lost beneath mud, and a new beginning after the waters withdrew. That does not require one flood to explain it. It requires human beings living near water. And humans have always lived near water because we had to. Rivers, lakes, wetlands, and coastlines were not just pleasant places to settle. They were the great engines of survival. They fed us, connected us, carried our boats, made farming possible. Let towns become cities, and cities become kingdoms. But they also reminded every generation that nothing built beside water is fully permanent. In the ancient Near East, we can see especially clearly how stories themselves travelled. The flood hero of Mesopotamian tradition appears under different names across different texts. Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim. The details shift, but the deep structure remains recognizable. A divine decision, a chosen survivor, a vessel, the preservation of life, birds released over the receding waters, a world remade. The biblical story of Noah belongs to this same wider literary world. That does not mean it is merely a copy, or that its authors had no ideas of their own. The differences matter enormously. In the Hebrew account, the flood becomes a story about justice, covenant, restraint, and the moral responsibility of humanity. But the similarities with older Mesopotamian traditions are too close to dismiss. They show that ancient storytellers inherited patterns, reshaped them, and gave them new meanings for new audiences. Stories can travel almost as far as rivers. They pass through merchants and migrants, through marriages, wars, exiles, and long journeys. A tale told in one city can become sacred memory in another. And when it arrives, it joins older local memories. The river that flooded too high, the storm that tore through a coast, the lake that burst its boundary, the sea that slowly claimed ancestral land. This is probably the truest way to understand the global flood tradition. Not one answer, but many layers. There were local river floods, sudden and devastating, capable of destroying the entire known world of a village or town. There were tsunamis and storm surges, events so violent that survivors might remember the sea as a living force. There were rising seas after the last ice age, slowly swallowing shorelines where people had hunted, buried their dead, and built their homes. And there was the human mind itself, always searching for meaning in disaster. Because water is more than water in a story. It is chaos. It is grief. It is judgment. It is the loss of everything familiar. But it is also cleansing, renewal, rebirth. When the flood recedes, the survivors step into a world that is terrifyingly empty, but also open. They must begin again, plant again, build again, teach their children what happened. Maybe that is the memory beneath all the different versions. Not a memory of one exact day when the entire planet vanished under the waves, but a deeper memory that life can change suddenly, that safety can disappear, and that survival depends on cooperation, foresight, luck, and the stubborn refusal to give up. We still live with that truth. Even now, rivers overflow, coasts erode, storms intensify. Entire communities face the ancient question of whether to stay, flee, rebuild, or remember. The old flood stories do not give us a single scientific explanation for the past. But they do offer something quieter. They tell us that people before us faced waters they could not control, mourned what was lost, and still found ways to continue. So when we listen to these stories, we are not only listening to myths, we are listening to humanity, speaking across time from riverbanks, shorelines, mountain slopes, and ruined cities, saying, "The waters rose. We were afraid, some of us survived, and we remembered." If this journey through the ancient flood stories helped you relax, or gave you something new to think about, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from tonight. And if you would like to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify through the link in the description. Until next time, may the waters be calm, and may your memories carry you safely home.